The word had been given. The advance across the graveyard had been costly, with the death of the Prophet in rags taking the support of the Psycho-Lord circles of Wids from the forces of chaos. It was a costly loss, especially since the Coven had then demanded all remaining wild Psychos be brought to them immediately, forcing them to mobilize further forces to escort them. But one did not ignore the demands of the Coven. Countless more ambushes, mines and other traps had also taken their toll. He estimated that his original force had been deprived of several thousand fighters. But at long last, Valamus Galliard was ready to begin the assault on the western gate of Asthena, with an army still counting in the tens of thousands at his command. Decaros had appeared to give him the order to launch the assault minutes ago, before vanishing to return to whatever plots the Lord of Shadows still had going on. Valamus was curious what they were now that the conquest of Paraxis Alpha was reaching its endgame, but he had far more pressing concerns. The regent had studied strategy in his youth, but it had been more of a hobby than anything else. The Galliard house was not usually involved in open warfare, it just wasn't their style. At most, it had been involved in small-scale engagements when things between it and a rival reached a point where intrigue and assassinations were no longer enough. If Valamus survived the war with his position, that would hardly be a handicap. The role of the regent according to the Accords was precisely to do all in his power to prevent things to come to war. But he supposed that proving his ability in case it did come to this was necessary to reinforce his authority over those he would have to rule in the Forsaken Son's name, and thus he was grateful for the opportunity granted to him to do so now. Of course, his role as regent would only become relevant after the planet was conquered by the Forsaken Sons and the last traces of loyalist resistance eliminated. Once, he would have thought that victory could go to either side. The Sons of Kalth were valiant warriors, and they had an army at their command that was both loyal, well-drilled, and without anywhere to run. But he had seen the size of the legion he commanded. He also knew that there were 3 others out there, and that his was arguably the weakest of them, or at least, it had been before the Loyalists' nuke had torn through the plague zombies at the south. But unless the Sons of Kalth had a lot more such surprises planned and the Forsaken Sons didn't have anything left in reserve, something he doubted immensely, then the end result of the war was obvious. Even if the Loyalists somehow managed to defeat the ground forces of the rebels, their fleet would simply flatten the Hive City from orbit. The Sons of Kalth commanders probably knew it too, but they wouldn't give up. They were Astartes, and they would never surrender. The humans under their command probably wouldn't either. They had heard about the fate of Talek Sorn and Lemos, and Valamus had to admit that death was preferable to that. The Lord of House Galliard, for he still had the title, until his appointed successor had finished learning all that he would need to know, shook his head to free his mind of wandering thoughts. He stood atop the ruins of what had been the home of a relatively wealthy merchant, surrounded by reinforced steel plates quickly arranged into a commanding bunker. Around him were those he had brought to him to the fated meeting in Suntorius Governorial Palace: Taluk, the bulky thug; Amelia, the seductive assassin; the nameless servitor that had once been Valamus' cousin; and Jar, the unbound psyker. The first 3 formed a loose triangle around him, ready to defend him from any threat, whether it came from the Loyalists or their own ranks. As for Jar, he was deep in trance, his mind connected to all the commanders of the various forces under the regent's command. Runes had been inscribed on his face by the sorcerers of the Coven, to channel his power and prevent him from killing himself with wild warp energy, as well as shield him from demonic possession. The Psyker was speaking an endless stream of reports and information, shifting from one sub-commander to the other while keeping the same emotionless tone, in contrast to his face, frozen in an expression of agonized horror at the strain the operation forced upon his mind. Valamus himself had ditched his usual formal vestments for an equipment more adapted to the current situation. He was now wearing an antiquated suit of power armor, picked out of the treasure vaults of the Galliard house and repaired and upgraded by the best heretics money could buy. While far from being convenient to move in, and a shadow of the massive armor used by the legionaries, it offered Valamus a degree of protection unmatched by the war gear of any of the soldiers under his command. "It's time," he told Jar as he lowered the oculars he had been using to check the position of some of the most important forces under his command. "Captain Tarox," he began before pausing, giving the Psyker time to align with this particular sub-commander, "you may now proceed." "Understood, Lord Regent," answered Tarox. His words were little more than a growl, but it wasn't as if he actually needed to speak them for them to be transmitted. The thing the Forsaken Sons had given him and the other leaders picked up his thoughts and sent them to this wretched psyker that the Galliard kept as a pet. It sent all of his tactical observations in a continuous stream, which must certainly be a nightmare for the psyker on the other end to manage, and could send more precise messages if he focused upon it. The device was a particularly foul kind of demon trapped inside a flask of warded and reinforced glass that hung from his belt and had to be fed with a few drops of his own blood every day to keep the link active. According to the sorcerer who had handed it to him, it created some kind of conduit between him and the psyker. The Astartes had assured him that only words could transit through the link, but Tarox was far from tranquil nonetheless. He may not be the most esoterically minded signatory of the Accords, but he still knew that words alone had the power to kill, and he was enjoying his current existence, freed from the constant fear of devolving into one of the Breakers, far too much. He may effectively be enslaved to the Forsaken Sons now. They had yet to honor Decaro's promise of granting him access to the genetic reforging which would truly make him safe from devolution, but the mere fact that he could sleep at night without having to struggle to retain his humanity made it worth it. And besides, it wasn't as if he had ever truly been loyal to the Imperium. He had joined the PDF because fighting was one of the rare things he was good at, and he had risen through the ranks by surviving longer than others during the heresy and by showing that he was willing to follow orders from above no matter what they were. Faith in the God Emperor had never looked appealing to him, and he had sneered when the ecclesiarchy had risen to prominence on the planet. Long before the Lord of Shadows had appeared before him in the Underhive, the renegade PDF captain had turned his back on both the Empire and its ruler. What had the Emperor ever done for any of them? His men had fought to help keep his peace, and yet they had still been turned into monsters in the end. The so-called Master of Mankind had done nothing for them, betraying his promises of hope and salvation. At least Khorne was honest in what he demanded of his followers. He shook himself out of his reminiscences. It was time to do what he had been elevated for, bring death and ruin to those who stood against the Forsaken Sons. He turned his gaze from the ramparts to look upon those who had followed him from Santorius to this place, a horde of thousands, looking at him in rapture, spreading out in every direction from where he stood, beyond the reach of their enemies' weapons. It was rare for a leader to stand amidst those under his command, and quite foolish also, but Tarox knew that these, the followers of the dark gods in body and soul, mutants and fervent believers all, would turn on him if he showed any hesitation in mingling with them. Besides, he had 5 breakers at his side, ready to tear anyone trying something funny to pieces. Tarox took a deep breath, filling his nostrils with the scent of excitement and bloodlust coming from the army surrounding him, and bellowed, "In the name of Khorne, charge!" "Blood for the blood god!" screamed the mass of unwashed flesh in 10,000 voices as it rushed forward. It was like a tide, splitting around Tarox's position as if he were a rock in the middle of a stream. Despite the madness that claimed them, the Riches still had the instinct to stay away from his breakers. Skulls for the Skull Throne. They arrived as far as 50 meters from the wall before the carnage began. Mines detonated under their feet, reducing a dozen men and women to pieces with each blast, while the defenders fired at the advancing horde with heavy bolters and gun turrets. They didn't need to aim their shots. With so many targets, it was virtually impossible to miss. Hundreds died in seconds, but the rest of the mutant army kept going, their minds driven into a frenzy by the smell of their kindred's blood. Eventually, those who were lucky or resilient enough to survive the barrage reached the base of the wall. The fortification in itself wasn't especially high, but the mutants were especially well equipped either. Most of them were reduced to banging on the wall impotently, shattering their hands against the compacted rock, while others began to climb up using what the warp had given them instead of hands. Others had managed to build and carry primitive ladders or grappling hooks at the end of makeshift ropes, and they were attempting to set them in position while under continuous fire from above. Few managed to reach the top of the wall, and those who did were immediately dispatched by the Sons of Kalth spread out across its length. Save for a miracle happening in the next minutes, none of them would manage to do any kind of significant damage to the enemy. Tarox gnashed his teeth together at the spectacle. Part of him was enraged at this wasteful expense of his forces, but he had to admit that he ultimately cared little about these wretches, which was probably the reason why they had been chosen for this task in the first place. Tens of thousands more dwelled in Santorius Underhive, ready to follow him or anyone else willing to give a purpose to their bleak existences. He gave them that purpose through the path of Khorne, allowing them to wash away their doubts, fears and self-disgust with the blood spilled on the battlefield. Their deaths, as pointless as they may appear, were actually the most meaningful thing these poor souls had ever accomplished. No, what truly irked the Lord of the Breakers was that he wanted to join in the slaughter. The mutation suppressants were preventing physical degeneration, but not even the sorcerers of the Coven could remove the touch of the dark gods from a soul. He belonged to Khorne, whether he liked it or not, and the god of war had left his mark upon his blood-stained soul. He hungered for battle, to charge to and kill as many as he could until he was slain in turn. It was only by exerting every iota of his will that he, and by extension the rest of the Breakers, remained under cover. That, and the knowledge that the charge was only a diversion, meant to occupy the defenders and force them to waste ammunition while the sinister agents of the Tenebrae Lex were put into position. Unlike the cowards leading his enemies, 4th Captain Artorios of the Sons of Kalth fought on the front lines, by his comrades' side, whether they were human or Astartes. His power sword had already slain several of the mutants who had managed to reach the battlements, while his bolter remained mag-locked to his thigh, down on its last clip. At the beginning of the charge, he too had emptied his weapon at the enemy, but now was the time to start sparing his ammunition for what would come next. He doubted whatever heretic the Forsaken Sons had seen fit to put in charge of this rabble would have sent his forces to their death without purpose. There was something here that he didn't see yet, a move that was hidden by the thousands of lives thrown at the wall. "Captain," came the voice of his sergeant Ilias. "Look over there." Artorios followed the direction his brother's chainblade was pointing at. Far behind the mutant horde that was being put out of its collective misery by Imperial guns and blades, a group of silhouettes in defaced Mechanicum robes was arranging itself in an eightfold star pattern around some device crackling with unholy energies. Despite the distance, Artorios' helmet visor and his own enhanced eyes were perfectly capable of picking up the details, and his lips curled in disgust at the sight. Heretics, he thought as he recognized the telltale signs that the Imperium had come to associate with the word. Former disciples of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had thrown away the tenets of the machine god and their loyalty to the Emperor in favor of pursuing demonic sciences and forbidden knowledge. What are they doing? He wondered aloud. They don't have any. The words died on his tongue as a horrible metamorphosis engulfed the 8-robed adepts. Flesh and augmetics twisted and extended, tearing apart the vestments and combining with the others, reforming around the focal device in the circle's center. A few seconds later, the heretics were gone, and in their place stood a massive and grotesque cannon, too big to have been formed only from the mass of the sacrificed acolytes. Streams of utter, absolute blackness ran along the hideous amalgamation of flesh, metal and warp stuff, and its end appeared to contain the very fires of hell. A swirling mass of tentacles supported it, squishing on the ground as they moved it on position. More importantly, it was currently aiming itself at the wall, moving on its own to target the gate that the defenders had sealed as soon as the last squads had gone into hiding within the graveyard. Artorios reacted at once. He blink-clicked an icon on his retinal display, his armor opened a vox link to his reserve squad, and he all but screamed his order as he sent coordinates and pics down the channel. "Destroy that thing, Nalil." The assault squad took to the air on wings of fire. Nalil and his battle brothers jumped from the single high structure which remained in a 1-kilometer stretch behind the wall, a tower designed to relay vox traffic, which had been converted in an observation plate form. Even with the altitude, though, the sergeant could already see that they were going to fall short of reaching their target with this single jump. They were going to crash. The reunion between an assault marine and the ground was, in Nalil's opinion, far too violent an affair to call it a landing, straight in the middle of another traitor force, and would have to fight their way to the demon engine before it unleashed whatever payload it was capable of. Despite the urgency of his task and the grim situation of the last free city on the planet, the sergeant smiled. It had been too long since he and his squad had spilled treacherous blood. For the Emperor and the Primarch, he roared as he came down upon the renegades, the master of mankind's wrath rendered into ceramite. Men's bones were shattered by the impact of his arrival, and they pressed away from the rest of the squad, afraid of being crushed without any chance of fighting back. This wasn't cowardice, for these riches were far too gone to care about their own lives. The unhealthy gleam of zealotry burned in their eyes, and they looked at the Astartes in their midst not with fear but hatred. Nalil recognized these eyes. He had seen them on Kalth, when he had faced the cultists that the 17th had brought to the world. It was not courage, nothing as noble as that. Courage was the exertion of willpower to surmount one's fear, and he had seen plenty of it within the Imperial soldiers who had fought at his side during the underworld wars on Calth. But these mortals weren't afraid at all, their minds wiped clean of such emotion by the brainwashing of their overseers and the corruption running through their souls. They cared only about the manner of their death, and about earning the favor of their dark patrons before their souls were torn from their flesh and ushered into the afterlife they thought awaited them beyond the veil. Fools, thought the son of Calth as he began reaping life with every strike of his chainsword. If the librarians of the chapter were to be believed, all that awaited the souls of the servants of ruin was an eternal hell, at the mercy of the demons they so worshipped. The rest of his squad came down around him, and together they carved a path through the mass of screaming cultists. The traitors were armed with makeshift weapons and small-caliber guns, but it was their number which truly posed a threat to the assault marines in their midst. The pathetic attacks directed at the squad had almost no chance of piercing the sacred ceramide of their armor, but through sheer mass, the cultists were preventing them from advancing. It would take precious moments for their jump packs to cool down from the particularly demanding jump they had just made, and by then the cannon would already have opened fire. Faster! He roared to his squad mates as his chainsword cut something with 5 arms in 2 distinct parts. In the name of Guilliman, faster! The squad redoubled its efforts, and the soil became slick with blood and pulped meat. Every blow was a killing one, with many strikes reaching more than one target amidst the mob surrounding them on all sides. But no matter how many of the cultists they killed, more came to take their place. They were driven on by a man standing at the back of the horde, who was shouting passages from a book he held before his eyes with rabid fervor. Taking that bastard down would probably have broken the momentum of the cultists, though it was just as likely to send them into a frenzy instead. Unfortunately, the preacher was too far to take down with the bolt pistols carried by the squad, at least, not without giving an opening to the rabble around them. Too slow, he thought. We aren't going to make it. As if his thoughts had shaped reality, the glow of the demon engines more started to brighten. From the angle of the cannon, Nalil's enhanced mind could easily trace the trail of the next shot. He may not know what kind of projectile the abomination would use, but it was a certitude that it would hit the wall. Perhaps at the gate, perhaps a bit to the side, it would not matter, both were equally robust, and the heretics may be insane, but they weren't stupid. They wouldn't have deployed this engine if they had not had good reason to think it could breach the Loyalists' defenses. The assault marines were still a good 50 meters away from the demon engine. Time seemed to slow as Nalil considered the possibilities still open to him. In the blink of an eye, he found the only possible path, and took action. With a particularly savage blow, he forced the tide of degenerates back for a fraction of a second. Instead of pressing his advantage, he unclasped a fusion grenade from his belt and pushed down the activation rune, setting it up so that it would detonate on impact. Then, with a prayer to the Emperor on his lips, he hurled the weapon above the cultists and toward the demon engine. The grenade flew in a parabolic arc, ending its journey straight into the maw of the demon engine. It plunged down its throat and detonated inside its grotesque belly with the force of a newborn sun. Warp-twisted mad genius met the fury of cold, unyielding science, and was found wanting. The abomination exploded in a burst of shrapnel and chaotic energy that engulfed several more groups of heretics who had stood too close to their colleague servile creation. For a fraction of a second, as he stared into the ball of hellfire, Nalil thought he could see faces in the inferno, the screaming souls of the Mechanicum renegades, consigned to their fate by the destruction of their combined form. There was a pause on the battlefield as heretics and space marines alike looked at the devastation. A cheer rose on the battlements as the Loyalists witnessed the destruction of the most imminent threat to their continued resistance. Simultaneously, a clamor of despair and terror rose from the gathered ranks of traitors still in reserve. "Now you are just showing off," commented one of Nalil's squad mates. "Believe it or not, that wasn't exactly what I was aiming for," answered the sergeant. "Well, it certainly worked nonetheless. What do we do now?" Nalil took a look around him. The cultists were frozen still, looking at the ruination of the demon engine with slack jaws. But soon, that accursed preacher started speaking again, and they quickly shook off their stupor to return their attention on the space marines in their midst. However, the zealotry and hatred in their eyes was now mixed with another emotion, fear, still not of the transhuman killers clad in blue and green, but of their own master's wrath at their failure. They still sought death at Nalil's squad's blades, but now it was to avoid the fate reserved to them if they survived the battle. That didn't make them any more of a threat, but Nalil and his brothers could accomplish nothing more by remaining where they were, still dangerously exposed, in the middle of enemy ground. "We are turning back," the sergeant announced to the rest of his assault squad. "We will cut our way back toward the wall and use the jump packs to get back on the battlements." Valamus swore violently as he watched the Tenebrae Lex's creation torn to pieces. He cursed the incompetence of Kurgan's horde under his breath, vowing that the renegade priest would pay for his flock's failings. There had only been 10 of the Astartes, and the cultists had numbered in the thousands, yet they had been unable to hold them for the 5 or so minutes it would have taken for the demon engine to fire at least one shot. It would be him who would have to explain to the leaders of the Tenebrae Lex what had happened to those of their own that they had attached to the army, and he was not looking forward to another meeting with the heretics. The cultists weren't even able to stop them from returning to their lines. Even now, he could see the assault marines rising again, ineffectual shots trailing uselessly behind their retreating forms. The enemy had inflicted considerable damage to Kurgan's fanatics, crippled the Tenebrae Lex, and they had not suffered a single loss in doing so. If this continued, he could say farewell to his position as regent, and quite possibly to his continued existence as well. Decaros had proved before that he didn't take failure kindly, and the Spireborn had little doubt that the Awakened One was no different. He couldn't afford to mess things up here and now. There were still several options open to him, and he quickly considered them. He could send in the Unbound, but they would endure great losses in taking the wall, and Valamus was under no illusion that the Astartes weren't rated far higher in Arkansas' team than the mortals were. He supposed that made sense from the perspective of the Forsaken Sun's master. Astartes were costly to create, whereas humans were plentiful. That left him with another option, though he would have preferred not to use it so soon, or at all, if he was honest with himself. Some things were disquieting even for him, but if he had a choice between them and the Forsaken Sun's displeasure, he knew what he would choose every time. He turned to Jar, and commanded the Psyker to link with the one who called himself Sir Petelius, the leader of the puppeteers. The wild Psyker shuddered as he established the connection, his mind reeling from the contact with Petelius' own psyche. When he spoke, his posture was no longer neutral, he was trembling from the strain of that particular link, fighting off the madness dripping from the puppeteer's mind. The wards covering his skin were no use, for they were designed to protect his soul from the Empyrean's denizens, and the true horror of Petelius' kind was that, for all their hideous plans, they were still very human. "Lord Galliard," he said, "what do you want from us?" "I need you to clear the battlements, to give cover to those who will give the rest of the force an opening. Are your tricks up to the task?" Despite the fact that the actual Petelius was far away, Valamus could feel the anger his dismissive order brought into the puppeteer lord. Good. The wretch unnerved him, and though it was petty to talk down to him while they weren't face to face, it would be well to remind him of where he stood in the hierarchy. The very reason the puppeteers had come to be what they were, after all, was because they believed themselves to be possessed of rights and privileges far above their station. Before the coming of the storm, the members of the cult had been rich men and women, holding important positions in Paraxis economy. When the madness of the warp had descended upon the world, they had tried to keep their employees calm, but where others had done so by allowing preachers of the ecclesiarchy to enter their manufactoriums, they had instead chosen to drug the poor bastards food and water. At first, they had simply spiked the supplies with calming agents, but they had grown bolder over time, and reduced their workforce to dead-eyed husks, which had quickly drawn the attention of the world's authorities. Valamus had little in the way of details about what had happened next, but it seemed that a battle had taken place between the forces of the Arbits and the brainwashed minions of the Cabal, ending with a cataclysmic chemical explosion that had left the few puppeteers who had survived horribly scarred and completely mad. They now lived trapped within a delusion that Paraxis had turned against them without reason, and had joined forces with the Forsaken Sons purely to avenge themselves for this perceived betrayal. The Lord of the Galliard House personally thought that they had only gotten what they deserved. Even for one such as him, robbing other people of their freedom of thought was an abhorrent deed. Even the Forsaken Sons didn't seem to go that far. But he had wisely kept that opinion for himself. Decaros had chosen to take the puppeteers into the service of the Warband, and they had proven their use during the arrival. "We will take the walls for you," Jar finally relayed as Petelius grudgingly acceded to Valamus' authority over him. "But the Sons of Kalth will probably be immune to the effects of our mist. We have never had an opportunity to experiment on Astartes before. So long as you keep them busy, it is all we need. We will do more than that, I promise you." The connection was closed, and Jar's posture became a lot less tense. Valamus, however, couldn't afford to give the psyker time to recover from the unpleasant link. "Tell Tarox to advance the ram under the cover of the puppeteer's move," he ordered. Tyr opened that gate. The next wave of the traitors advanced toward the walls in an unhurried, inelegant gait. They wore full isolation suits, the kind worn by medical personnel amid quarantine zones or in radioactive arenas. The face of each was covered in a heavy gas mask, and they bore on their back a pack of tubes, gas containers and other machinery that pulsed into their lungs the exact mix of drugs and gases that kept them alive. The dosage varied for each individual. They had all designed and fabricated their own life support engine in the days after the explosion that had made the planetary authorities think their cult had been wiped out. There were 30 of them, each with several humans wearing chokers whose chains were linked to the belt of their masters. To the defenders, those were barely recognizable as humans anymore. They were cadaverously thin, and stared forward with dead, empty eyes as they walked. All of them carried on their back yet more gas containers, and were hunched forward by their weight. To the defenders, it seemed impossible that these riches had the strength to carry the massive cylinders, yet they kept advancing regardless, keeping pace with their masters. More of the slaves walked without collars, but they weren't as wretched, and carried weapons and pieces of armor over their abused flesh. These were fighters, not beasts of burden, even if they sported the same dead-eyed expression. There were hundreds of them, tightly packed around their masters, forming a wall of flesh. Already warned by the heretic's gambit not to let an enemy's distance deter them, the defenders opened fire with long-range rifles, but every shot ricocheted against energy shields which flared with each impact. Several of the slaves fell, but the masters appeared invulnerable to the loyalists' ranged weapons. When they reached a spot about the same distance as the heretics before them, they stopped, and the slaves carefully put down the containers. "We could attack them again," suggested Nalil over the vox, his eagerness plain in his tone. "Whatever they are planning, me and my squad can stop them." "No," replied Artorios. "You and your squad will return to the top of the observation tower and remain in reserve until I order you otherwise." "Captain, if we do nothing, we are giving them the initiative. Haven't we learned long ago that allowing the slaves of chaos time to plot is a mistake?" Before Artorios could answer to his sergeant that his previous deployment had been a desperate measure, and that without the extended range granted by jumping from the top of the tower he and his squad would be exposed to the traitors' fire for more than 100 meters without cover of any kind, something caught his attention. Each of the silhouettes in isolation suits stood amidst a circle of gas containers, and held its arms toward the wall. The slaves activated the opening mechanism of the containers, and plumes of cyan mist began to hiss from them, gathering several meters above the heretics in an opaque cloud that blocked the loyalists' line of fire. Was this the answer of the traitors, pondered Artorios? To give themselves cover so that they may advance on the wall while preventing the defenders from taking a clear shot? If so, it was a singularly foolish plan. They had eyes below the mist, with small openings in the wall stuffed with pic recorders in order to have the best image of their foe's position at all time. They would be able to direct massed fire straight into enemy groups even without a clear line of sight. No, there had to be more to their plan. Just as the captain thought this, the cloud of mist began to advance toward the wall, despite the absence of wind. Its advance began slowly, but quickly accelerated, as if it were a solid object accumulating momentum. Something akin to dread dwelled in Artorios as he watched the impenetrable wall of mist come ever closer. "Gas masks!" he shouted, not bothering with the vox, instead trusting his enhanced lungs to carry his warning to all defenders. "Brothers, seal your helms. All of you without a gas mask, get off the wall." "Too late," murmured Petelius, as the puppeteer heard the desperate cry of the Space Marine commander. Behind his suit, the burned-out remnants of his lips twisted into a smile that belonged only to a corpse in the throes of rigor mortis. "By Kalth's bleached sun," murmured Artorios in horror as the clouds of gas reached the ramparts. Despite his warning, many humans had not had time to leave the ramparts. They had been prepared to fight and die here, to give their lives to defend the city. When the command had come to withdraw, many had hesitated. Not long, just a few seconds, but that had been enough. And now, their reluctance to step back before the enemies of man was costing them everything. Those who breathed in the chaotic mist were turning against those who didn't. From what Artorios had seen, there was a moment of struggle after the first inhalation, during which the unfortunate victim tried to resist the poison coursing through his or her respiratory system. But none managed to resist it, and soon they became similar to the slaves outside the walls, staring at the space marines with empty eyes and blank expressions, holding and firing their weapons with the same skill that had been drilled into them by the sons of Calth in preparation for this battle. "No," whispered the captain as several of the mind-controlled soldiers turned their lifeless gazes toward him. "Throne of Terror, no." The soldiers brought their weapons to bear, and before they could fire, instinct and training overcame Artorios' doubts. The captain launched himself at the mind-controlled mortals, and with a single swipe of his word, he severed their necks, sending their heads toppling to the bottom of the walls. He screamed in outrage as he saw the blood spurt from their headless torsos, and cursed the Forsaken Sons and their allies for reducing him to such an extremity. "Captain," came a voice over the vox, "the traitors are advancing a ram toward the gate. It is carried by several of the huge mutants we noticed among their ranks. I think they will be able to pierce through the gate if given enough time." Artorios swore violently as he was forced to cut apart yet another loyal servant of the Emperor with his power blade. The plan of the traitors was obvious now: keep them busy with the mist while they tore down the gate. It had been reinforced, but the workers had been pressed by time, and this was no gate of the Imperial Palace, capable of sustaining months of intense cannonade before it gave way. It would fall, and there was nothing the defenders could do to prevent that. He had no choice. "Sons of Calth," he called over the vox, "abandon the wall. Withdraw to the next line of defense. To all Imperial forces, do not approach the western front unless you are equipped with a gas mask." He shifted frequencies, passing to one only his battle brothers could hear. The next words were heavy on his tongue, but he understood all too well that, in this matter too, there was no choice at all. "And once you are on the second line, if you see any of our human soldiers approach without wearing a gas mask, open fire." "That's better," declared Valamis to no one in particular as he watched the carnage on the battlements unfold. With their own forces turning against them, the Sons of Calth were too busy to attack the breakers carrying the ram, and they were slowly but surely giving ground, acknowledging the futility of resisting on their current position. Soon, the mutants' human strength in the warp-forged metal of the siege machine proved superior to the gate, and the twin plates of reinforced steel were torn apart by the blows. They did not fall. Their hinges were probably the most robust part of the wall, but there was now an opening in Asthena's wall. Already the breakers had abandoned the ram and were forcing their way in, their inner bloodlust no longer contained by anything as minor as a giant wall standing between them and their enemies. They wouldn't make it to contact, of that he was certain. There would be a lot more ground to cover between the wall and the next of the Sons of Calth's many lines of defenses and fallback positions. Fortunately, there was a force in his army particularly apt to that kind of job. He ordered Jar to open a channel to the leader of the most dangerous element of his host. "It is time, Lord Lucian," he declared with far more respect than when addressing the other sub-commanders. Lucian may be technically under his command for this operation, but he was still in Astartes, whereas Valamis was just one mortal. The former sergeant had already been a veteran of the Great Crusade back when he had just been a baby. "There is a breach in the gate, and our foes are falling back. You and those in your charge may now break the enemy." "About time," muttered Jar, his voice turning to low pitch of Lucian's augmented throat into a ridiculous grumble. "Not sure I could keep them leashed any longer. The unbound thirst for blood." "And they shall have it," murmured Valamis as the connection was severed before commanding Jar one more time, "Give the order to everyone else to advance as they will into the city." "We aren't going to be able to keep control of them," noted Taluk, displaying insight that surprised Valamis. No matter how many times the thug proved he wasn't just a mass of muscles and violence, such was his appearance that his master kept forgetting it. "That was never the plan," the Galliard Lord explained. "Lord Arkan ordered me and the other forces to break through the wall and disperse our troops into the city to do as they pleased, in order to force the Sons of Calth to do the same to defend the population. I think the Awakened One knows that keeping control of our allies would be almost impossible and planned his strategy accordingly." Taluk grunted his understanding. Then, suddenly, he launched himself at Valamis and shoved him toward the other side of the room, his physical strength enough to displace even the armored form of his lord. Valamus crashed against the wall, and before he could utter a word of protestation, Talak's head turned into a bloody pulp. A fraction of a second later, the sound of a bolter being fired reached Valamus' ears. From his position across the ruined street, Viros cursed the fates as the bodyguard took the bolt meant for his master. The son of Kalth did not know how the man had localized him. Perhaps he had caught a ray of light reflecting on Viros' bolter, or perhaps the warp had whispered in his ears to preserve the life of one of its champions. "Missed," he announced redundantly over the vox, as he hastily stood from his prone position and started running. "Get in and finish them." 3 men emerged from their own hiding places. They were all that remained from Viros' squad. The rest had fallen honorably in the raids and ambushes that had afflicted the traitor forces during their walk through the graveyard. Each of them carried short-range laser weapons, models which sacrificed range to increased firepower. They had recovered the guns in one of the caches left in the graveyard. Their standard equipment had no chance of piercing through the armor of the heretics' leader. They had watched the advance of the traitors, accumulating intelligence and sending it to their allies behind the wall. They had identified the leader of the renegades, and isolated his position. So far, the massive traitor forces surrounding him had made any approach impossible, and they had been forced to watch as the wall fell to blasphemous sorcery. Now, however, they had an opening. If they could kill the fallen lord of House Galliard, the enemy would fall into disarray. Without a clear commander, they would be more vulnerable to the schemes of the city's remaining defenders. Viros' bolter shot had been their best hope of success, and the last of the Space Marines' ammunition. Now, they could still fulfill their objective, but their chances of surviving the operation had gone from slim to almost non-existent. They didn't care. They had already lived longer than they had thought they would when they had gone to the graveyard. The first of them who entered the war room was killed by a creature that, at first glance, was a scribe servitor. The flesh of its arms suddenly split, revealing energized blades that severed the soldier's head in a single sweep. The second loyalist shot the thing in the head, vaporizing its remaining brain matter alongside most of its skull. There was no doubt that the tech priests on the side of the renegades could repair it by replacing the skull and placing a new brain within, but for now the construct was immobile. 1 second later, the soldier felt something prickle at his chest. He looked down to see a handful of darts standing over his heart. When he looked from where they had come, he saw Amelia, who smiled at him in the 2 more seconds it took for the cocktail of venoms to make their effect. Agony coursed through his veins, and he fell, dead before he hit the ground. The third soldier was shot in the head by Valamus himself before he could even point his own weapon toward the traitor leader. Like Talak, his headless body collapsed on the ground, but unlike the bodyguard, there was no blood. His neck had been cauterized by the shot that had killed him. Amelia turned toward her master for an instant, signaling her appreciation of his marksmanship with a wink. And that was then Viros reached them. As the Space Marine entered the confined space of the battle, the female assassin jumped toward him, graceful as a great feline, her poisoned nails aimed at the warrior's throat. Faster than Valamius could follow, the Astartes twisted in her direction, and his left arm caught her in the torso with the strength of the raging Grox. All air left the murderous chest in a pathetic shriek of pain, and her trajectory was violently altered. Amelia crashed against the wall with the sound of breaking body armor, and slumped down on the floor in a whimpering heap. Now that he didn't risk hitting her, Valamus shot in the direction of the Astartes. Like his armor, his weapon was a family relic. It had been fabricated during the dark age of technology, and had been preserved for centuries in stasis before he had chosen to take it with him to what was quite possibly the first battle the weapon had ever been used in. It was a laser pistol, with 3 barrels combining to unleash enough firepower to melt a stone wall. He had chosen the weapon because it looked like it could pierce through Astartes' power armor. Now he would see if he had been right. The first shot went wild. The second hit the son of Kalth in the right shoulder, leaving a blackened spot on the ceramite. The third and fourth hit the loyalist straight in the chest, and Valamus smelt burning flesh. The laser had reached beyond the armor. That slowed the Astartes, forcing him to breathe deeply to coax oxygen into his tormented lungs. The heat of the blast had permeated through his fused ribcage and cooked the organs, but he could still force them to function, though he wouldn't be able to speak for weeks at the very least. Despite his wounds, the Space Marine was still walking, combat knife held tight in his right hand. Valamus' armor incorporated many weapons, some of which would even be enough to take down an Astartes at such close range. Yet the regent found himself unable to move, fixed in place by the look of pure, undiluted hatred on the son of Calth's face. He felt as if he was facing the emperor himself, risen from his golden throne in spite of his wounds to look upon him and punish him for his many, many transgressions. The sound of engine drew the attention of both Space Marine and Heretic Lord to the side of the building, through an almost entirely collapsed wall. Their gazes met the rear end of a Thunderhawk, the hatch open to reveal a silhouette clad in cobalt power armor, with a horned helm and holding a staff crackling with warp energy. The son of Calth didn't hesitate. Upon seeing the sorcerer, he launched himself straight at Valamus, intent on completing his mission before he could be stopped. But he wasn't fast enough. The sorcerer held his hand up, and the loyalist froze in midair. Even his face was locked in an expression of fury. To his own surprise, Valamus discovered that he found out the look to be quite beautiful, in its own way. There was something pure in such dense hatred, even if it was directed at himself. Never before had he seen such depth of emotion, and it wondered him that it was on a Space Marine he was witnessing it. The Astartes were notorious in the Imperium for their stunted emotions. Slowly, deliberately, the sorcerer descended from the Thunderhawk, his ceramite boots pounding on the gunship's ramp. Behind him, 3 huge cylinders were being pushed along on anti-gravs, manned by a small and twisted humanoid that Valamus recognized as the wretch that had checked his credentials before the meeting of future faction leaders, back in Santorius Governor Palace. The Chaos Marine walked between Valamus and the son of Calth, and bowed so that his helm was face to face with the loyalist. Valamus heard words being exchanged, but he couldn't recognize the language. Then the sorcerer stood straight, and with a casual gesture of the hand, the neck of the son of Calth twisted and broke with a chilling crunk. "I thank you for your assistance," said Valamus while bowing low. "My lord?" "I am Paranefer," answered the sorcerer, finally looking at the mortal. "You have transmitted to your sub-commanders that they can do as they see fit from now on?" "Yes, my lord. I will take command of my own troops and—" "Enough," interrupted Paranefer. "Your part in the assault is over, Galliard. There is little more you can do here, and your life is important to the continuation of Archon's plans, though you shouldn't believe yourself irreplaceable. Your armed forces will add little to the war effort at this point, whether the Loyalists realize it or not. They had lost this battle long before the first shot was fired. Return to Santorius with your men and wait for further instructions." "Is this the will of Lord Archon?" asked Valamus, carefully phrasing his words so as not to appear rebellious. "It is," confirmed Paranefer. "I was coming here to test my creations," he gestured toward the cryopods, "and Archon asked me to update your orders while I was at it. Although seeing that my intervention saved your life, I wonder if he had another purpose. Well, it doesn't matter for now. Leave this place, Galliard. Your part in this war is over, and you have served well." "As you wish, my lord," said Valamus. "Amelia, how are your wounds?" The assassin had managed to stand up, though she clearly had difficulties doing so. She had to lean on the wall to advance, but she indicated to Valamus that she could move. The regent noted that she used sign language and not her own voice. She probably didn't trust her voice right now. Maybe she had a few ribs broken. No matter, as long as she was alive, the medics of House Galliard would be able to patch them up. There was nothing they could do, however, for Talak. And Jar. Jar wasn't in any condition to leave, Valamus realized. The Psyker was down on all four with his back to the wall, desperately trying to push himself further away from the sorcerer's cohorts. He was staring straight in their direction with bloodshot, terrified eyes. Carefully, Valamus moved closer to the Psyker, drawing his gun as he did so in case he needed to neutralize Jar quickly. The wretch did not react to his approach at all, his attention entirely focused on the cryopods and their handler. "What's wrong, Jar?" asked Valamus, as softly as he could. The Psyker jerked at his words, before slowly turning his head toward his master, but even then, his gaze kept returning to the pods, and his hands and feet kept trying to push him into the wall. It took him several tries before he could talk. He was trembling so badly that Valamus worried for a moment he was going to bite off his own tongue before explaining what had spooked him like that. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was even more shaky than usual, and from what little Valamus was able to read from the Psyker's general body language, he wasn't in the middle of one of his crises. That was worrying for several reasons the regent didn't care to list right now. Death, Jar finally said. Death and lies, lies, lies. Falsehoods, blasphemies. The fates are laughing and the enemy approaches under the shadow of servitude. The sons of kings will face each other in the ruins of hope, and the eye will burst open to let loose that which lies within. Burn it, master. Burn it, burn it, burn it now. Valamus knew better than to attempt to get a clearer answer. To those who saw into the warp, everything had significance beyond what the mundane eye could perceive, and everything they said when attempting to describe it was a riddle that only them could truly understand. Instead of trying, he activated one of Jar's injection mechanisms, and watched as the psyker calmed down and slipped into unconsciousness. Only after he confirmed that he hadn't accidentally killed him with an overdose did he turn his gaze back at Paranefa and the strange devices he had brought aboard the Thunderhawk. Nothing had ever scared Jar like that, even when the warp storm had been raging in all its terrible fury, back at the very beginning, when Neverborn had walked the streets and thousands had died each hour in the streets. Back then, the psyker had laughed and cried and shouted, telling of the horrors which had birthed each of the demons stalking the shadows of Santorius. Valamus didn't know what lurked within the sarcophagi. He didn't think he would like it when he learned it, either. At the same time, he couldn't simply act on Jar's words and try to destroy them, mostly because the sorcerer could kill him even more easily than he had dealt with the would-be assassins. It would probably be best to keep an eye on Paranefa's moves from now on, and his valuable assets away from whatever the sorcerer had planned. And for good measure, it would be even better to do exactly as Paranefa had said and get back to Santorius until the war was over. As he prepared to leave, he heard the sounds of battle from behind the wall. The Unbound had passed to the other side, and thousands of mortal fighters followed. No doubt that the same scene was repeating itself on the other three fronts. To the south, the Plague Legion would have used its demonic engines to tear down the walls so that the undying horde could enter. In the north, the Raptors would have attacked the battlements so that the Gene Lords could use whatever xenotech they had constructed in their hellish city to open a breach. And in the east, well, the east was commanded by Archon himself. It was very doubtful that it would take longer for the Awakened One to break the wall that it had taken Valamus. The battle for Asthena had truly begun. He screams as he sees his father fall. All around them, the world is dying in an inferno started by ignorant barbarians. The great towers have crumbled, their foundations torn apart by the wolves' bombing. The libraries, which held in their archives the collected wisdom of 1,000,000 worlds, have been burned to ashes by 6th Legion's flamers. Priceless tomes, tablets, rolls of parchment, and relics of 100 more shapes have been destroyed in the wanton rampage of the Emperor's butchers. Pyramids of glass perfectly arranged according to geomantic patterns and observation towers aligned with the stars have been reduced to dust by the tremors of fighting war engines. The last survivors have gathered at the command of the greatest of them, standing defiantly against those who would be their executioners. Ahriman has called them, pulling them from 100 battlefields to stand with him at the foot of the Great Pyramid. He is the one who refused to bow and let the wolves kill them. He is the one who led them in this fierce, desperate battle to protect their home, their people, their lives. Ahriman's soul shines with power greater than any other legionary of the Thousand Suns, and for a moment the dreamer can seize the future echoes of what the captain of the Corvidae will do and become in times yet to be. It is a vision as beautiful as it is dreadful. There they waited for the final battle, when the wolves of Fenris and the other murderers of the Emperor would come for them. They are ready to die. But they are not ready for what they are seeing now. Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, their father and king, is laid low by his most hated brother. His back is broken upon the Wolf King's knee, cast down like an idol of old. Agony radiates from him, but he is not defeated yet. His one eye stares at his gathered sons, who stare back in shock, horror and sorrow, and something changes in him, some great decision is made, and the galaxy itself holds its breath as it waits for Magnus' choice to be revealed. The Crimson King screams in defiance of fate, and unleashes power unlike anything he ever has before. The last legionaries of the 15th Legion and their human allies are engulfed in a wave of warp energy, their minds blanking out in the face of such awesome might. The last thing they see is the legion that murdered their homeworld at the Emperor's command, standing before them with the burning city of Tizca in the background. Arsim, Lord of the Coven, brother to Archon the Awakened One and known amongst the Forsaken Sons and their fearful servants as the Sorcerer of Blood, opened his eyes. Slowly, His mind drifted away from the remembrance and back into the present, which he saw through the tinted eye lenses of his psychic hood, the only reason he had allowed himself to lapse into a trance in the first place. The memory had been an unpleasant one, for it brought with it the knowledge of his own past ignorance, of the many betrayals that had brought the Thousand Sons so low. They had been betrayed by the Emperor, who had desired to crush mankind's ascension as a psychic race with his edict. They had been betrayed by the wolves, who had come to Prospero with hatred in their hearts and ready to murder their cousin's world. They had been betrayed by Magnus, who had hidden the coming of the Sixth Legion from his sons until it was too late, out of some misguided belief that he could earn forgiveness for his sins by dying a martyr, and had been willing to drag his legion down with him only to change his mind at the last moment, when he himself had faced judgment. And they had been betrayed by Horus Lupercal, who had deceived them into thinking the Emperor was the one who had ordered their purge, while he had been the one who had changed the Vlka Fenrika's orders from arrest to execution. The truth of Horus' deceit had been revealed to the Thousand Sons aboard the Hand of Ruin soon after the siege had ended, but Arsum suspected that Magnus had known it for much longer. Though his father had proven over and again that he was a fool, he was far from ignorant, and little escaped the sight of his cyclopean eye. He would have known the exact reasons of the wolves' coming, but he had not shared them with his sons. There had been whispers among the rest of the Thousand Sons too, when their rage at the wolves didn't blind them entirely, but no proof had been found, or if it had, those who had discovered it had either chosen to remain silent or made so by the War Master's agents. Archon had been the one to give the truth to the members of the 15th Legion among the Forsaken Sons, soon after the end of the Exodus and the binding of Serek Sithar. But even knowing that the Imperium's forces had been manipulated by the War Master had done nothing to quell Arsum's hatred of the Galactic Empire he had helped to build as a captain of the 15th Space Marine Legion. His eyes had been opened to the truth of the Emperor's lies, and to the power of chaos. There was no going back for him, nor for any son of the 9 legions. With blood and fire, he had freed himself from the Emperor's shackles, and while his soul may now be marked by the Great Mutator, and, if the Herald of Blood was any sign of it, other powers as well, he was still his own man in the ways that truly mattered. His existence was his to choose, and he had chosen to give his loyalty to Archon, the one who would make the most use of his talents in the long war against the Imperium. The sorcerer stood before the walls surrounding Asthena, atop a stopped rhino transport. He was studying the battle raging on the battlements, where packs of Forsaken Sons were fighting squads of Sons of Kalth and human soldiers. Like his non-gifted brothers could smell the scent of blood and gunpowder, he could sense the rage and death emanating from the wall, rising from the thousands of souls involved in the struggle. He could sense countless never-born spirits pressing at the city's borders, eager to feast on the powerful emotions and the souls of the fallen, yet unable to do so. It was clear to Arsum that the battle was in his brother's favor, but many had already fallen, their armored corpses falling down the wall and crashing on the ground. Too many. They should have torn their way through the defenses. The Coven could have brought low the wall, turned its very stones to dust through the power of the warp. But the Sons of Kalth had prepared for this. Even now, Arsum could feel the combined might of the chapter's librarians, all linked together in a Gestalt entity that shielded the entire Hive City from sorcery. It was similar to what the Loyalists had used in Meridus, but even stronger, with all the remaining librarians taking part, their efforts bolstered by the few human psychers who had survived this far without losing their minds or being shown the truth. They would home in on any user of psychic power inside the city within seconds, and any weaving of the warp unleashed from beyond their reach would be shattered the moment it entered the zone of effect. It was probably very taxing on both legionaries and mortals, but it was very effective. Clearly, the Sons of Kalth had learned one of the most important lessons the 13th Legion had been caught when the Word-Bearers had turned on them, that the power of the warp was an essential part of any battle against the Illuminated Legions. Arsum, the Coven, and the various demonic allies gathered by the Forsaken Sons were useless so long as the Gestalt was active. Even the shapeless spirits of the Immaterium were unable to go beyond the city's walls, which spoke of more than breathtaking power and control. Somehow, the Sons of Kalth had managed to harness the power of the false faith spread by the ecclesiarchy, channeling it into their spell to act as a barrier against the Neverborn. That wouldn't last for much longer. He had just broken the psychic connection with Orpheus, the only member of the Coven who was accompanying the Northern Army. They had just finished breaking through the wall. Arsum didn't understand how his colleague could bear the prolonged presence of the Shy Islet. The resurrected Eldar were abominations even by the standard of traitor Marines, xenoforms whose very essence had been rewritten by the Dark Prince. Arsum understood their usefulness to Arkan, and the Sorcerer Lord even knew the true reason for their resurrection, but even if he didn't object, he still found the necessity of this alliance repulsing. Standing near one of them was enough to set any practitioner's teeth on edge. Their attuned senses could perceive the creature's wrongness even more acutely than ordinary mortals. It was probably due to Orpheus' own link to Slunch that he could stand the Shailath's presence. Now, all four armies had entered the Hive City. The Sons of Kalth were ready to unleash their counterattack, a succession of ambushes and withdrawals across the entire space of the Hive. Despite the numbers massed under the Forsaken Sons banner, all of their armies were still insignificant compared to the size of Asthena. They could walk for days without finding a single enemy or each other. With the warp storm raging, Vox and Auspex would be all but useless. Sorcery could locate the Loyalist forces, but the Librarians prevented that. The Warband and its allies would take months searching for the Sons of Kalth, and it was all too possible they would be bled so much in the process that the Sons of Guilliman would be able to claim ultimate victory, though there would be little left of the city itself by that point. Even if they managed to exterminate every single Loyalist, it would leave them far weaker than they had been before they arrived in the system. It was a good plan, Arsum had to admit that. Had the Forsaken Sons been led by any lesser warlord, it could even have worked. But Arkan had anticipated the move of the Sons of Kalth, and he and Arsum had devised a countermeasure. It would take considerable resources and effort, but its success would all but guarantee the victory of the Forsaken Sons in Asthena, and by extension, in the whole Paraxis system. The sorcerer descended from his perch and rejoined the rest of the coven. The sorcerers were standing in a precisely arranged circle, holding their focuses in both hands before them, most favored staves, but a few used swords inscribed with runes of power. One, who had been a member of the 17th Legion before casting his allegiance to the Forsaken Sons, held a short ceremonial dagger between his palms, and a thumb, not unlike the rumored weapon that was said to have brought low Horus Lupercal at the dawn of the heresy. There were 11 of them, while Orpheus was accompanying the Shailat in the north. Paranepha had gone to the west, allowed by Arkan himself to perform the final test of his own personal project. They came from different legions, but like all those who had been trapped on the Hand of Ruin during the desperate flight from Terra, they had cast aside the disagreements which had existed between their bloodlines and come together as one powerful cabal. Even during his days amongst the Thousand Sons, Arsum had never seen such a group as the Coven. Not in raw power, there were many cabals and circles within the 15th Legion which would have surpassed them, but in the sheer diversity of skills and approaches to the art. In the time since the Exodus, Arsum had learned more about the warp and its denizens than he would have thought possible. He had underestimated the lore accumulated by the other legions, like most of the Thousand Sons. Pride had ever been the greatest flaw of both Magnus and his sons, but Arsum had sworn to himself that he would learn from his legion's past mistakes. Such was, after all, the only thing the past was good for. Arsum took his appointed place, completing the 12-pointed circle. Flickers of lightning began to course from one focus to another as the sorcerers gathered their power, and the skies above flashed in reaction to what was taking place below. At the same time, those sitting within the circle in chains began to moan and wail, sensing what was about to happen even if they didn't truly understand it. Dozens of men and women in dirty rags had been dragged to the ritual's location. They were the Wids gathered by the Prophet in rags before he fell to a loyalist ambush. Without the leadership of the Prophet, the wild psychers were not just useless, they were a danger to the renegades as well. The moment Arkan had learned of the Psyker Lord's death, he had ordered them to be contained and brought here. They could still be of use, but the Coven members didn't have the patience required to teach such wrecks how to use their power. More than half of them had already been driven mad by the storm and the whispers of the Neverborn, and without the iron will of the Prophet uniting them, more were succumbing with every passing hour. But it would be a waste to simply kill them, even if it would have been a mercy for the tortured souls, though given what awaited them on the other side of the veil, Arsum doubted even that. If they couldn't serve the Forsaken Sons with their lives, then they would serve them with their deaths. Arsum took a deep breath as he gathered yet more power, linking his mind with the other members of the Coven. He could feel his brothers raising their own defenses, preparing to defend their souls from the demon's hunger during the ritual while letting their own power flow through the link and into his own being. Their wills would shield him as well, allowing him to dedicate all of his focus to the task demanded of him. All of the sorcerers started to chant their own mantras, slipping into a meditative state according to each one's personal traditions and preferences. Some called upon the dark gods for their blessing, while others focused their minds through ritual chants, and others still recited the names of fallen comrades to stir the fire of their hate. Around them stood 50 forsaken sons, keeping watch on the coven's physical form while their spirits waged war against the foe. The moment the sons of Kalth realized what was happening, they would think of striking at the sorcerers' defenseless bodies, but they would be too busy fighting the invading forces to be able to send enough warriors to defeat the pacts defending the ritual. Asim's mind reached up to the highest enumerations, sharpening his mind for the coming battle. Power flowed through him from his colleagues, far from that which he had wielded on Parasksis Gamma, but terrible nonetheless. The collective psychic might of 12 sorcerers was nothing to scoff at, and there was yet more power at his disposal should he need it, as he thought he would. But first, he had to engage his foe, to make his presence known to the circle of librarians maintaining the psychic construct over Asthena, and issue his challenge. As he closed his eyes, his stare met the eyes of one of the chained Wids, and though there was more than 10 meters between them, he unwillingly caught his own reflection in the wretch's cloudy eyes. As always, he saw not his own armor, but the horned crimson form of the Herald of Blood, and he heard the demon's voice, as if it was whispering into his ear. "You should let me help you, Father." He ignored the demon's voice, and let his spirit leave his mundane perceptions behind as his ethereal self abandoned his flesh and raised into the roiling streams of the warp. At once, his conscious mind projected images and forms to the senseless madness of the Empyrean, creating a psychic representation of the mental battlefield upon which he would face the sons of Kalth's librarians. His own spirit took a form similar to the one he had in the material world, though he couldn't help but notice that one of his armor's shoulder pauldron now bore the sigil of the blood god, while the other was emblazoned with the mark of Zeonch. He could feel the conflicting energies emanating from the two symbols, but they did not turn on each other. Both were fueling his emotions and power, not exactly working in concert but not interfering with each other. Once again, Asim wondered just what game the dark gods were playing with his soul. "I could tell you that secret, Father. It would cost you so little, and you would finally be freed of the burden of doubt." In this realm, the voice of the herald came from within his own armor, but he ignored it again, as he did with the implications of this provenance. Flames and screaming souls surrounded his psychic body, which floated in an endless abyss, where physical directions had no meaning but were still tentatively used by his mind to try to understand the madness of the warp. In the distance, he could see a huge wall of golden light with cracks of pure blackness running on its surface, the faithful city of Asthena, fighting against the legions of darkness. Neverborn spirits were clawing at the wall of faith and loyalty of the city's defenders and denizens, trying to find a way inside and claim the body of one of the millions of civilians as their own. But they were kept at bay by the light, which emanated from all souls within the city and was directed by "Found you." Atop the wall of light stood a being that looked similar to what the ancient Terran myths called an angel. It was an humanoid clad in armor the color of clean skies, with twin wings of golden fire rising from its back. In its hands, it held a staff ending in the symbol of the Imperial Aquila, a symbol that was also present on its chest. Power radiated from it in waves, and Asim felt the emotions that fueled it: confidence, determination, honor, duty. Threads of golden light were running up and down the staff, and the angel was staring straight at Asim. Its face was a golden mask shaped in the image of a noble, haughty face locked in a perpetual expression of cold, righteous fury. Asim remembered seeing some of the Blood Angels wearing similar masks during the Siege of Terror, and he knew that some word-bearers had also adopted similar headgear before and after their turning to chaos. It echoed the ancient traditions of several cultures of old Earth, who had once buried their nobles in similar masks. Of course, Astartes did it for different reasons: to make sure their enemies knew the face of their killers, to honor their homeworld's tradition, or for more esoteric purposes. He suspected that the reason why the angel wore one was because, since it was constituted of the combined minds of several librarians, it did not have a face of its own. For a moment, the two stayed still, glaring at each other and trying to get an impression of their opponent's capabilities. Then, the angel, no, Asim corrected himself, the son of Kalth's thought construct, sent a message to the sorcerer. It was wordless, a pulse of emotions and concepts that was only rendered into words by Asim's consciousness. To his faint surprise, the voice was not a chorus but a single, hard tone, and it spoke in Tizcan, the language of his own thoughts. "I see you, traitor. And I see you, false angel. Do you feel no shame in assuming such a form? Or have the sons of rational Guilliman come to believe the lies fed to the Imperium's masses about the nature of their transhuman protectors? I am the bound circle. I am the shield of the innocents, their defense against the evil you serve. This appearance merely reflects how they think of me." Arsum sneered at the construct's posturing. His contempt radiated from his spirit in the form of cruel, laughing shadows that leapt in the angel's direction, only to be consumed by the fiery light surrounding it and dissolving back into the ether from which they had been spawned. "You are a lie," sent the sorcerer, loading the message with as much conviction as he could gather. "A symbol of false hope, the promise of a salvation that will never come. I am a warden. I am the defender of their souls. You are an abomination. A traitor to the Emperor, and a slave to ruin. Your very existence is an insult to mankind itself." Wrath swelled within Arsum's mind. What did this creature, this lifeless construct of combined thought, knew of him? He was Arsum of the Forsaken Sons. He had fought at the side of his legion during the burning of Prospero, uncovered the secrets of chaos on Sortierus, burned a path across the galaxy when he had joined the rebellion, and unleashed his mightiest sorceries at the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. He had been betrayed by the Emperor, by the Imperium, by his father, and by Horus Lupercal himself. He, himself, had never broken his word. It had always been the other party which had betrayed him first. Some part of him realized that he was lying to himself, but he ignored it. It was of no use to him, and it would only make him weaker, and in this new existence that was now his lot in the galaxy, weakness could not be tolerated. Cobalt and crimson flames rose from his armor's joints, and he held high his staff in front of him, channeling as much power as he could for the first strike. The Neverborn surrounding him howled in animal joy at the display of power, mindlessly bathing in the spiritual warmth of the sorcerer's rage. "I am no slave," he pulsed. "I was once, but no more. Now it is only the fate of you and your brothers." And then, he unleashed his attack. The power took the form of one of Arsum's usual attacks in the material world, though it was far more powerful than anything he could have accomplished alone. A stream of black fire roared from the staff's extremity, but before it could engulf the angel, it was dispersed by a stream of golden light. The angel's counterattack took the form of a rain of fire that clung to the armor of Arsum's spiritual form like acid, burning through his mental defenses. He felt the contempt and hatred of the loyalist librarians as they weaved their own emotions into the spell, and laughed. The intensity of the emotions was just so weak compared to those dwelling in his own soul that he could only laugh at them. "You know nothing of hate," he sent to the construct. "You know nothing of what it makes us do, or of the power it grants. Let me show you." Then he called upon the power of the Wids trapped within the Coven's ritual circle. Though the link he had with the mortal psychers was tenuous, he had no need to listen to their petty, terrified thoughts. He still felt a dozen of them twist in agony and die, their souls drained of power by the sorcerers around them. At least, he thought absently, their souls wouldn't have to endure the eternal tortures of demonkind. They were doomed to oblivion, their essence burned away to serve the needs of their masters. In return for their sacrifice, a wave of black light born from their torment pulsed from Arsum's psychic form, scattering away the fire of the angel's attack. Then, with a surge of carefully controlled fury, he hurled his avatar at the loyalist construct, flying through the distance separating them in the time it took to him to think of it. Their forms clashed with the thunder of opposing gods, sending sparks of unbound thoughts and emotions all around them. Around them, the image of Asthena's great wall began to dissolve, as both the Coven and the bound circle elevated their thoughts, slipping deeper and deeper into the ether, where material forms had even less meaning, while the energies unleashed by the battle tore the reflections of physical objects to shards of psychic essence. Soon, their avatars were the only things with any constancy of form, fighting a deadly duel in the middle of a storm of chaos. Their staves clashed again and again, each blow more a manifestation of will than an echo of martial skill. After several minutes of exchanging attacks in the midst of ever-changing madness, Arsum realized that he needed more power. The bound circle was strong, stronger than he had anticipated, stronger than he had thought it possible for a creation of witless loyalists. They had practiced for this, he realized, and not just during the battle for Merides. They had experience, they had probably used the same trick before, during the heresy and the galaxy-wide scouring that had followed. There was no telling how many sorcerers from the 9 legions had fallen to them in the past. The construct had quickly recovered from Asim's onslaught, and was holding its ground. The unity of thought gave it the combined skills of all those who composed it, while Asim could only call upon his own knowledge and experience of the warp. But while the loyalists held the advantage in discipline, he had the upper hand in raw power, both because he himself was superior to any of his opponents, because he had more mortal psychers to call upon, and because he didn't care if he drained them dry. And in the end, if you had enough of it, power was the only thing that mattered in a duel of minds. With a snarl, he called forth more energy from the Wids, draining them of their lives so that he may claim victory. But as the stolen power ran through his soul, it burned him, searing at his thoughts like liquid fire, threatening to shatter his concentration. It was all he could do to avoid the sudden attack from the construct, who had felt his distress. That made no sense. He had wielded far greater power before, when he had unleashed the great ritual that had teleported millions of mortals from one world to another. Though he had suffered from it, he had been able to complete the spell, yet now, wielding a much lesser if still considerable power, his very being was slowly torn apart by the energies of chaos. For one terrible second, he thought that he had unknowingly maimed himself, that the healing he had bargained for with the Herald had been incomplete. The dark gods gave you what was agreed upon in the bargain, Father. Your power was restored to what it was before you struck the deal with the Scions of Mighty Khorne. But then he understood that the situation had been different back on the penal world. He had been able to wholly focus on channeling and weaving the power, instead of reacting to the ebb and flow of battle as he was now. He had only needed to steel his own self against the raging energies as they ran through the mental pathways he had set for the ritual. To those who could wield the power of the warp, the state of mind was just as important as the power itself. He needed to place himself in an emotional status that would give him the advantage over his opponent, and fortunately, he knew exactly how to achieve that. The vision he had just before the beginning of the battle had shown him the way. Diverting part of his focus away from the battle, he dredged up old memories that he had spent years trying in vain to forget. He brought images, sounds and scents to the forefront of his mind, ignoring the pain as grief and regret tore at his twin hearts. Around him and the false angel, the warp reacted to the emotions the memories caused in him, and soon the two were no longer fighting amidst random chaos. Sorcerer and Thought Construct now stood in the middle of a replica of Tizca during the burning of Prospero, frozen in a single moment of time. Rather than the final confrontation at the foot of the Pyramid of Photep, this was a scene of the battle itself, when the madness of civil war had raged across the streets of a loyal city. Around them, 1,000 Suns legionaries and their allies of the Spire Guard were immobile, locked in combat with Space Wolves, Custodians, Sisters of Silence and other Imperial forces. The shadows of Titans loomed on them all, the god machines similarly frozen in time. For a moment, both combatants stopped their duel, instead taking in the vista around them. Even the swathes of dust and ash that thickened the illusory air between them were static. Finally, the sorcerer broke the mental silence. "Look well around you, false angel," sent Asim. "This is the true face of the Imperium. No matter how civilized you may claim to be, at the core of it all your emperor and the dark gods are the same. The ruinous powers are just honest about it." "The wolves were deceived," answered the construct. "Even if they do not like to talk about it, and claim that the Battle of Prospero was their triumph, they can never quite hide the doubt in their hearts when they speak these words. It was Horus who ordered you world burned, the father of the one you follow now." Asim laughed bitterly at the construct's pathetic attempt at a psychological attack. Did the librarians animating it believe he had not known the truth of Lupercal's deceit? Did they perhaps think he would turn against Archon, enraged by the revelation? The fools. "You were there when the 17th burned Calf," he sent back. "You saw your world die at the hands of madmen. Tell me, O noble son of Gulaman, if you had been told that they believed such destruction was the will of the Emperor, would you have accepted it? If you had learned that the word-bearers had been deceived into thinking you traitors, would you have forgiven them? Would you still fight for the Imperium?" The angel didn't reply, and Asim struck it with a wave of wrathful power. It broke through the construct's shield and sent it crashing against the frozen image of a warhound titan's foot. For the blink of an eye, its golden form lost its coherence as the psychers who granted it substance were stunned, but they quickly realigned their thought patterns and the construct was restored. "Tizca burned because we were too weak to defend it," but at least we fought as soon as the wolves touched the ground," sent Arsum as he marched in his foe's direction, no longer caring if the sons of Calth within the creature could hear him. The words were for himself, to fuel his emotions, and with them, his ability to control the awesome power granted to him by the ritual carried out by his brothers. Anger, hatred and torment were the sustenance of chaos, and the ruinous powers rewarded those who indulged in them. He was dimly aware that his words weren't making the kind of sense a scion of the 15th Legion was supposed to. All sons of Magnus had been trained in the art of debate, sharpening their minds through intellectual practices long before they were taught the first secrets of the art. Now though, he was lying to himself, ignoring the stark differences between Calth and Prospero. He was also aware that it didn't matter. Sense and logic had no value in the warp. It had been the mistake of the Thousand Sons to believe otherwise. These were things of the materium. Here in the Sea of Souls, instincts and emotions were the natural laws. But Calth, he felt the rising anger in the construct at the mention of the dead world's name, and he reveled in it. The warp around them also reacted to the name. Countless Neverborn had feasted on the planet's suffering when the word-bearers had bathed it in fire. Calth burned because you were too weak to fight the word-bearers as soon as they opened fire on you, instead of waiting for your Primarch's permission like children. You have learned much since then, I will grant you that, but so have I. I will never be weak again. He drew more power from the circle, not even feeling the lives he extinguished any longer. His mind was burning with the rage of a betrayed warrior. Hatred strengthened him, enabled him to ignore the searing pain in his physical body as he channeled more and more warp energy through it. Black fire and dark lightning surrounded his psychic form, and the emblems on his shoulder plates shone with a baleful light. "And what will your strength bring you?" sent the construct, its words loaded with contempt. "What will the dark powers you sold your soul to grant you in return, traitor?" "The only thing left for me to desire, revenge," pulsed the sorcerer, his silent voice carrying all the hatred that dwelled within his heart. "This city will burn, false angel. What was inflicted upon Tizca will be as nothing compared to what the Forsaken Sons will do to Asthena. In time, the whole Imperium will burn, and from its ashes something stronger and better will rise. But not here." The Lord of the Coven let out a stream of energy at the angel, pinning it to the ground and tearing at its insides. He felt something burst within, like an organ in a living being when submitted to the same kind of treatment in the material world. He heard an agonized scream, and he laughed as he understood that one of the psyches composing the creature had just died. "There will be no conquest this time," Arsum continued as he pressed his advantage. He brought low his staff, piercing straight through the construct's breastplate, eliciting another dying scream as the soul of one more librarian was lost to the warp. No pacification of the streets and reducing the human livestock into servitude to a different set of idols and masters this time. No sons of Lorga spreading the word of the Octid as we search for worthy servants among the masses of our slaves. Asthena will burn for its defiance of chaos, for its loyalty to the false emperor. This is the will of Arkan, a sacrifice to the gods so that all on this world understand the price of defying us. Keeping the construct locked on the imaginative ground, unable to stand, Arsum poured all of his anger and hatred at it, using the illusory staff as the medium. The angel shrieked in pain, one of its creators dying after another, but still it tried to fight back, its power scattering uselessly against the black fire cloaking Arsum's figure. When it tried to speak, its words were no longer in Tizcan, and the voice was no longer serene. Instead, they were sent in Gothic, and expressed as though through clenched teeth and a mouthful of blood. "You will not win. This city will be where the story of your pathetic warband ends, sorcerer." "No," replied Arsum, twisting his staff in the creature's psychic guts as they did so. "It will be the place where your chapter dies, the souls of your warriors fed to the warp to fuel the Awakened One's grand design." And then, at last, it was enough. The angel let out an anguished cry as those whose power gave it form finally grew too weak to maintain its existence. Its form collapsed in a shower of golden energy, the last thoughts of its collective mind scattered to the winds and whims of the warp. The echoes of its mind scream quickly dissipated, and nothing remained of the entity that had called itself the Bound Circle, except for those who had created it in the first place. Arsum looked upon the shattered pieces of the construct, each the soulfire of a son of Calth librarian whose mind was fleeing back to his body. To his psychic sight, they appeared as streams of light, their wills too weakened by the confrontation to retain a stable appearance. Despite their defeat, Many of them still lived, half of the librarians at the very least. But they would be weakened by the battle, barely able to fight as legionaries, let alone as psykers. You know that they might yet be a threat, despite the humiliation you have inflicted upon them. We could kill them all, Father. Let me help you, and none of them will be able to oppose you again. The hounds of mighty Khorne will hunt their spirits and drag them before you if you are but ready to ask for my aid. The only price I will ask is the right to consume their souls." The sorcerer ignored the demon's words yet again, instead focusing his mind on slowly returning to his own body, unraveling the link between himself and the other members of the coven. The offer was tempting, of course, all offers from the Neverborn were, that was the point of them. Even the price wasn't one he would mind paying, but again, that was the point. Demons didn't tempt men into damnation by presenting it to them in such blunt terms. But Arsum knew that he had already gone too far with such pacts already. His soul bore the marks of the deal he had made to restore his power after his deed on Paraxis Gamma. If he relied on the Herald of Blood too much, he would grow dependent on the creature's assistance, and sooner or later, he would find himself in a situation where he had no choice but to accept a price he wasn't willing to pay. That was the nature of the warp, even if he had to admit that it was virtually unheard of for a creature of the blood god to display such patient planning. He opened his eyes to find himself on his knees, his armor covered in frost. His hands were stuck to his staff by the black ice, and it took him several seconds to gather the strength to break them free, each filled with the dread thought that perhaps his hands had become fused with the weapon's handle as a twisted joke of the Pantheon. He had seen such things happen before, among the Thousand Sons, during the heresy. Like all other legionaries, sorcerers put importance on their chosen tools. Several of the Forsaken Sons had been afflicted with a similar boon, their limbs fusing with their weapons. Even if Arsum was supposedly safeguarded from wild mutation by the rubric, he knew that his body was far from fully preserved. Wielding the true power of the warp came at many risks, and one of those was the alteration of the sorcerer's flesh. This time, however, his body appeared unchanged. Looking around, Arsum saw that none of the wild psykers had survived. Their bodies laid down within the circle, ravaged by the power the sorcerers had extracted from them. Many of them had been reduced to dust, while others were decaying rapidly. A few had been mummified by the energies of chaos as they coursed through their flesh. Their faces were frozen and the expression of mute horror they had worn as their very soul was drained from them. The Sorcerer Lord gave them nothing more than a glance before dismissing their fate. They had served their purpose. Instead, he tentatively reached out toward the city with his mind, searching for any sign that the barrier was still there. He found nothing. His psychic sense easily passed over the wall and into the streets of Asthena. There, he sensed the fleeing sons of Calv, who were abandoning the wall and retreating to their next line of defense. The spell of the librarians had been broken. Asthena was defenseless against the power of the warp. The mission of the Coven was a success. Now, it was time for the next step of the Forsaken Sons' plan. The Sorcerer Lord raised the warp flask hanging at his belt and stared at the single eye of the small Neverborn trapped within. "Mercurian," Arsum said, with his mind as much as his mouth. Despite his weariness, he felt the creature establishing the link with its twin on the Hand of Ruin without difficulty despite the roaring of the storm. There would be some interference, but the intent of the message would be transmitted. The techno-adept of the Dark Mechanicum knew that the sorcerer would only contact him for one purpose. The psychic barrier is down. Blood has been spilled on the four fronts. All is in readiness. Open the portal. His meditative state shattered, Chief Librarian Ortan Miranda opened his eyes. Tears of blood were running down his cheeks, and he was also bleeding from his ears and mouth. His skull was laced with spikes of agony, and his vision was blurred by the sheer amount of pain he was experiencing. It took him several moments of deep breathing and restorative meditation to clear enough of the pain that he was able to think somewhat coherently again, but even then, he wasn't in any state to fight. The psychic backlash of the Gestalt's destruction had taken its toll on his body and mind, and he wondered how the rest of the circle had endured. He was on his knees, in the same meditative cell where he had gone in trance several hours prior, when the assault on the walls had begun in earnest. It was small, with barely enough space for him to sit, and a few supplies were stocked against the wall, fresh water, rations and stimulants, in case he needed to stay there for weeks on end while keeping his strength. The place, and others like it across the city, had been prepared long ago in preparation for this very day. Here, The librarians were cut off and sealed from the physical world, able to focus all of their intention and power on the matters of the warp. Autan forced himself up, placing his hand on the wall and using his staff as a crutch to support his trembling legs. It took him several tries to turn open the heavy lock on his cell's door, but he finally succeeded, and pushed it open. He emerged into one of Asthena's streets, his appearance drawing the attention of a squad of his brothers. They approached their chief librarian, questions already on their lips, but before they could voice them, Autan felt something hot and vile tear through his mind, and he collapsed on his knees once more. The Space Marines rushed to his aid, but he ignored them, instead seeking the source of the blow. Though his sixth sense ached with the aftermath of the psychic battle, he sensed something stirring in the Sea of Souls. With the collapse of the barrier, immaterial demons were swarming into the city, and the son of Kalth felt a pang of grief for all the fallen whose souls were now defenseless, but he pushed it aside. It was hard enough to defend the living from the horrors of chaos. The dead were not his concern, they belonged to the Emperor. Yet there was more to the disturbance he had felt than that. It had not been an attack directed at him, the fact that he was still alive was proof enough of that. He had felt the shockwave of some grand event, and now he sought its origin point. To his surprise, it wasn't far from where he stood, a few dozen meters down the streets at most. He forced himself to his feet once more, and saw with his own eyes the source of the psychic disturbance. At the same time, his battle brothers did too, and drew their bolters. There was a hole in space, leading into the utter blackness that was how the human eye perceived the madness of the warp. It twisted with the sound of shrieking souls as the unnatural conduit imposed its existence on a resisting reality, and from its depths emerged a group of abominations. The creatures were a hideous melange of claws, fangs and blades, no two of them identical. They were humanoid in shape, with twisted limbs and other, stranger deformities, and their laughter as they arrived on Paraxis was a promise of slaughter and horror. Contrary to what Autan had expected, and what a human observer could have been forgiven for thinking upon seeing them, the invaders weren't demons, summoned from the Sea of Souls to wreak havoc upon the loyal servants of the Emperor. No, they were far worse. For all their power and the terror they inspired, demons were also afflicted with many weaknesses when they entered the material world. But these were beings of flesh and bone, but the unnatural power of chaos flowed through them regardless. Teleportation, which typically left any being shocked and stunned for a few seconds, had no effect on them, despite the crude method they had employed, ripping a hole in reality leading from wherever they had come from to Asthena. The chief librarian knew these creatures, for he had faced their kind on Kalth. They bore many names: Secondborn, Unburdened, Galvorback. To the Imperium, they were more commonly known as possessed, Space Marines who had allowed a demon to inhabit their own flesh, twisting them further than any other traitor legionary. The inhuman hungers of the Neverborn turned them into monsters, but it also gave them great power, at the cost of their soul and any lingering traces of humanity the traitors may still have at the moment of possession. The actual strength of a possessed varied greatly. At Kalth, some of them had been able to decimate entire squads of Ultramarines in mere seconds, while others had been brought down single-handedly by loyalist champions. The only thing they had in common was their depravity, though even that took various forms. Some had gathered and tortured helpless mortals to revel in their fear and suffering, while others had sought the strongest amongst the Ultramarines, in search of a worthy challenge. But regardless of the might and particular damnation of each member of the group before Autan, they were still here. Behind the Sons of Kalth's lines, in the middle of the city that the Loyalists had sworn to defend. The tactical implications began to emerge in Autan's mind as he understood that the Forsaken Sons had known that their foes would deploy the bound circle and plan accordingly. Librarians were the best prepared to face possessed Marines, but all of them were weakened by the battle against the Chaos Sorcerer's combined might. He had felt several of his brothers succumb during the psychic confrontation, their lives sacrificed in the altar of duty, only for the confrontation to end in the Sons of Kalth's defeat. "This is my fault," he thought in despair as he beheld the unholy host. Guilt, an emotion he was all too familiar with, crashed into his weakened mind, dumbing his thoughts. Standard teleportation was impossible due to the storm. Only through sorcery could the possessed have arrived here. And it had been his task to prevent the Forsaken Sons from using sorcery in the battle for Asthena. But he had been defeated. He and the other librarians, even the psychers they had gathered and trained in the ways of uniting themselves to create the bound circle. The Chaos Sorcerers had proven superior to them, though he did believe their victory had cost them. In the end, however, it didn't matter what price their foes had to pay, they had still won, and now monsters were loose in Asthena. The Sons of Kalth were facing enemies on 4 fronts already, and now they had another threat to deal with behind their lines. The chief librarian heard his brothers around him send word over the Vox, warning Chapter Master Menelaus of the new threat in their midst. They were talking to him too, demanding that he withdraw while they held the enemy at bay, ready to sacrifice their lives to save his own, despite the fact that he was the reason for it all. My failure is what allowed this to happen. As if hearing his thoughts, the greatest of the abominations turned in his direction, its eyes burning with infernal hatred as they stared straight at the Astartes Psyche. It was a towering giant with bat-like wings wielding a demonic axe in one hand and wearing the twisted remains of what appeared to be a world-eater's power armor. The light from Parax's sun, twisted by the storm, reflected off the metal in unholy patterns, forming runes of violence and madness. Despite his weakness, Ortan felt the incandescent rage within the creature's mind, the raw, undiluted bloodlust of the monster it had become, and the spark of horror of the warrior it had once been. "Blood for the blood god!" roared the monstrosity, its voice echoing like the screams of 1,000 madmen baying for slaughter. "Skulls for the skull throne!" Hatred and pain run through my veins as the demon's essence runs through my soul. Hecaran feeds on my emotions, turning them into power that it returns to our shared body in a process that is both painful and stimulate my wrath, creating a vicious cycle that forever increases the Neverborn's hold over me. But now, I do not care that it brings me further and further away from humanity and sanity alike. I welcome the power my monstrosity brings me, for I thirst greatly, and at least I have an opportunity to slake the burning need. It matters not that the thirst itself is a result of my changes, that it only grows worse as the demon grows stronger. All I want is for its torment to end, even if it is only for a moment. For the first time in weeks, I have been unleashed, let loose by the awakened one. Part of me resents him for keeping me in chains between battles. It reminds me too much of my Primarch's fate, after he was torn from his broken mortal frame by Lorga's sorcery and became an avatar of war and bloodshed. But I understand Darkon's motives as well. My control over what was once my own flesh is fading, replaced by a fusion of the demon's will and my battle instincts. There are too many risks in letting me roam freely. However, the demon in my heart cares nothing for reason and logic. As I waited, trapped by the ritual circles of the Coven and the word of my lord, its fury burned deep within my soul. Bloodthirst and Hecaran's screams of frustration slowly wore away at my mind, and it is with difficulty that I recall how I came to no longer be bound. I remember the sorcerers coming in the vast holding bay that has become my lair aboard the Hand of Ruin. With them came others of my kind, similar yet all different. Through the blood-red haze that covered my thoughts, I recognized them. Gal Vorbag, the spawn of Lorga with a Neverborn bound to their heart. They are smaller than me, most of them capable of keeping the demon within them under control outside of battle. Only a few signs betrayed their nature to the normal eye as they entered, but my senses are not mortal anymore. Gal Vorbag they are not. The true chosen ones are extinct, their lives sacrificed in devotion to the primordial annihilator in the war against the anathema. These are pale copies, who were made unburdened through rituals and incantations, not the violence and pain that tested the first flesh brothers. They are not worthy of the name worn by the Crimson Lord and his brothers. They are weaklings who gave in to their desire for power, instead of fighting for control of their own destiny until the very end, like you did. The sorcerers put the possessed warriors around me in an arcane pattern, then left us alone. Had I not been bound by chains of orders and magic, I would have destroyed them all. Or maybe be destroyed instead, for there are 12 of them, while I stand alone. But I endured, and waited, until the creature that is more machine and demon than man entered my shared lair. His minions laid down devices charged with the power of the warp, and several hours later, they rent through space at his command, creating a portal through the immaterium. I felt my bounds slacken at the distant command of Arkin, and hurled myself through, sensing that the other Secondborn were following. I felt the madness of the warp all around me, and sensed countless Neverborn held at bay by the presence of Hecaran and the other possessed zone demons. They hunger for our souls, as they crave those of all beings of the materium, but they fear the strength of those who lurk in our hearts and feed upon our emotions and deeds. And now, I emerge from the portal's other end, back into the material plane. And now at last we are free. The prospect of bloodshed lightens the burden on my mind, allowing my thoughts to run quickly once more. I can think clearly again, as my blood runs hot with the desire for violence. This is the hive city of Asthena, last fortress of the Sons of Kalth and the other loyalists on Paraxis Alpha. Me and the others have been deployed behind enemy lines through warp-touched technology. I do not know whether or not the others have received orders, but I know what is expected of me. To kill, maim and slaughter, to break the foes of the Forsaken Sons and claim skulls and blood for Khorne. It is all I can do now, all I am good for, all I have ever been good for. You understand the truth of yourself, Hector. Even now, there are those among your bloodline that resist the glory of the Lord of Skulls, refusing the honor he has bestowed upon them. They struggle vainly against the chains your gene father put upon you all. But their defiance changed nothing, they belong to him regardless of their willingness to do so. The chosen of Khorne made sure of it. My eyes fall upon a cluster of ultramarines, their armor pristine and shining with a reflected light. They stand before me, bolters raised, but I ignore their insignificant challenge. I look behind them, at the one they are protecting, whose soul burns brighter in my altered vision than any of them. I recognize the emblem on his shoulder, the different color of his armor. He is one of Gulaman's psychic sons, one of these fools who believe they can call upon the power of the warp without paying allegiance to the dark gods who rule there. At the sight of the librarian, Hekaran's sneering voice becomes charged with contempt. The sorcerous weakling has already been broken. His power is spent, and there will be little honor in destroying him, but his skull belongs to the blood god, and we shall take it. I charge at them, screaming my fury and release. Behind me, the rest of the possessed follow, some of them struggling to keep up with me, but all choosing to let me take point. They may share their minds with the spawn of the warp, but they aren't foolish. As soon as the last of them bursts free of the warp's embrace, the conduit linking this place to the hand of ruin collapses with a sound akin to the shredding of bones. It must have taken considerable power to keep it open and stable as long as it was, here in the warp storm. But the dark gods favor the Forsaken Sons, and make all things possible if one is willing to risk and sacrifice enough, especially if it is accomplished with the goal of killing the followers of the false emperor. The loyalists open fire, but their bolts fail to pierce my armor skin. One of them holds a las cannon, and aims it straight at my head. Time seems to slow as I can clearly see his finger tightening around the trigger, and for a moment, I am tempted to simply let him take the shot. No matter how much resilient I have become, there is still enough of the materium in me that such a hit will kill me, letting my soul fall into the fires of the warp, free at last of the thirst that consumes my every moment. No. But Hekaran refuses to let its host die so easily, and it seizes control of our shared flesh, jerking my head out of the path of the las cannon's beam. The heat of it burns my cheek, but makes no lasting damage. Still you think you can escape, brother? You belong to mighty Khorne, and will only die when he sees fit. My axe slams into the first of the Sons of Kalth, breaking through his war plate like a mace through wet paper. He isn't so much cut down as blown apart, the sheer kinetic energy of my blow sending pieces of his corpse flying all over the street. My return strikes beheads the warrior holding the las cannon before he can take another shot. The rest of them react quickly, abandoning their bolters in favor of close-quarter weapons. Two more fall back, each seizing one of the librarian's arms and dragging him away. How humiliating it must be for that proud son of Gulaman to be carried away like a powerless child. He must not be allowed to flee from us. Slay him, and the blood god will forget your moment of weakness. A swipe of my left hand sends a space marine flying and crashing onto the ground, where he is promptly beset by one of the possessed. Screams of agony reach my ears as the son of Lorga begins to tear the loyalist apart. In my right hand, my axe turns again, forcing the other Sons of Kalth to fall back and clearing me a path toward the librarian and his guards. One of the escorts abandoned his charge to stand before me, interposing himself between me and my prey. He holds an energized broadsword in both hands, like a champion of old earth challenging some monster of myth. He manages to turn aside my first blow, and his counterattack pierces through the skin of my abdomen. But the pain is nothing, and my flesh tightens around the blade, locking it in place. Before he can let go of it, a swipe of my axe pulverizes him, and I resume my advance, blood dropping from my wound and hissing on the ground as it burns through the permacrete. The last Son of Kalth shoots me with his bolter. At such range, Despite the fact that he is using one arm to help the librarian move along, every shell hits me. But they may as well be raindrops. The kill rages upon me, and Hecaran's power shields me, making what has become of my armor impenetrable by solid projectiles. I pick up the defender with my left hand and casually throw him behind me for the possessed to kill. Now I stand before my prey, towering above his kneeling silhouette. He forces himself to his feet, leaning on his staff for support. Despite the cries of Hecaran, I let him stand. No warrior of the Astartes should die on his knees. He stares at me from the shadows of his psychic hood, his eyes shining with warp fire the same color as his armor. But he is too weak to actually attack me with it. This close, I can see what Hecaran sees. The librarian's soul has been rent apart by the coven, and his very essence is pouring out of the tear-like blood from a lethal wound. He is emptying his soul into the Empyrean. I reach out with my clawed hand and put it on his head, tightening my fingers around his neck. Then, with a single pull, I rip it free from the rest of his body, tearing apart armor, skin, muscle and bone alike. Blood pours from the ruined remains of his neck, and his body collapses on the ground, feeble sparks of psychic energy coursing across dead meat and twisting limbs like a puppet with its strings cut. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. I roar my victory to the skies as I hold high the skull of my defeated foe. The heavens boom in answer, and behind me, I can feel the scar on reality left by our arrival tear open once more. I glance backward and see the rip into the skein of the universe, and as soon as it manifests, dozens of neverborn start pouring from it. Weakling servants of the Pantheon, but they can be of use. I sense something else slipping from the crack in reality, something vaguely familiar but that I can't place. However, there is no time for investigation. Battle calls. I howl once more, raising my axe, and possessed and neverborn alike follow me as I charge further into loyalist territory, guided by Hecaran's preternatural senses. They fall before us like wheat before the scythe. Be they Astartes or mere humans, Asthena's defenders are powerless to stop the monsters in their midst. I sense the gaze of the blood god on this city, like a baleful sun radiating heat in the heavens. The deaths of the sons of Calth please him, for they are worthy warriors all. Even the mortals fight well, refusing to give in to the terror I can sense in their hearts. They know that they're cornered, that there is no escape, and still they refuse to give in to despair. They stand their ground in the face of inhuman horrors, dying with a prayer to the false emperor on their lips. Misguided, for there is nothing the anathema can do for them now, but brave. In a way, it is even more worthy of respect than the sons of Calth's valor, for these humans know fear, yet rise above it through courage and duty. It makes their blood taste all the sweeter as it sprays on my armor and is absorbed into my warped flesh, but it also bitterly reminds me that those humans who fight alongside me do so out of fear, greed and madness. Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it does. But he does care for the quality of it. Where the slaughter of billions of weak-willed fools fails to quench his thirst, the ichor of a champion may temporarily satisfy it. That is why his scions ever seek out the greatest warriors to slay, for the glory of the blood god. I ignore Hecaran's ramblings as I advance. Does the demon think I don't know such things already? It has been repeating the tenets of Khorne to me ever since we were first united, what seems to be an eternity ago. I suspect I know more of the blood god's teachings than any chaplain of my former legion, if any still live, or even than the dark apostles of the word-bearers. It also speaks of many things, some of which I understand, most of which I don't. Sometimes, I think that the sons of Lorga among the Warband would be very interested in what Hecaran tells me, but I know even them aren't foolish enough to try to interview me. Revelations are useless to a headless corpse. I sense the stench of the anathema's braying slaves nearby. We shall show them that their faith in the corpse god cannot protect them from the champions of the true powers. Yes. I can feel it too, the burning light of faith, of devotion, of self-sacrifice. It burns in my sight like looking straight into a sun, despite the distance that separates me from its source. Something stirs in my heart as I watch the golden psychic energy radiating from deeper into the hive city, something unfamiliar and wholly unwelcome. I quash it with a surge of rage and contempt, and begin my way toward it. Whoever hides behind this light will soon understand that nothing can hold back the Forsaken Sons. As he charged through the ruined gates of Asthena's western wall, the thought that most occupied the mind of Zirak Volan wasn't, surprisingly, that he was most likely about to die a most sudden and gruesome death. Nor was it terror or disgust at the sight of the blank-eyed corpses that had once been Imperial soldiers, before the now dissipated gases had turned them against their Space Marines allies. It wasn't even worry that his short knife and self-built pistol would be useless against the flak armor worn by the Imperial soldiers, let alone ceramite warplate. No, the only thing he could think about was how magnificent the warriors that fought before him were. Unbound, he had heard they were called, and the name truly fit them perfectly. They wore armor the color of darkest night, for they belonged to none of the failed legions and called none of the flawed Primarchs their gene-sire. Many of them bore the emblem of the Warband upon their shoulder pauldrons, a demonic skull surrounded by chains, representing how the traitor Marines had tamed the wild powers of the warp to their own purposes. The Unbound had been reborn in the depths of the great starship Hand of Ruin after the heresy had ended, forged upon the anvil of Chaos Ascendant. They served no one but themselves and the will of the Awakened One, great leader of the Forsaken Sons and the only man to whom Zirak was willing to kneel. The way they moved, the way they fought, they were unlike not just the Loyalists, but even the other Astartes under the banner of the Forsaken Sons. There was a strength, an unrestrained energy to them that made Zirak green with envy. They weren't following orders, only their own impulses and instincts. They weren't held back by any concerns for those below them, and only linked with each other on the most basic level of brotherhood. In his eyes, they were perfect, so human beings, and yet he knew that the Unbound had once been normal humans, adolescent children who had been turned into demigods by the Forsaken Sons. The 16-year-old Hiver had craved to be one of the Unbound since he had first seen them in action at Merides. He hadn't followed the evacuation orders, like the rest of the sheep, but stayed behind and hid, so that he could join the side that would obviously win the war after the dust settled. Why so many still thought the Forsaken Sons could be stopped was beyond him. Anyone with half a brain could see that the forces of chaos were going to take Paraxis Alpha whether its people tried to fight back or not. In that situation, the smart thing to do was follow the strongest side, which also happened to be the side where he had a chance of becoming an incarnation of death. There were rumors among the human followers of the Warband that the Fleshmasters, the group of genetic sorcerers of the Forsaken Sons, were always watching the mortals in search of candidates. All Zirak had to do was prove his worth, and an eternity of battle and glory awaited him. The group he was running after counted 12 of the transhuman warriors, led by not one pack leader but two, with one appearing to be following the lead of the other. The leader carried a power sword in his right hand and a bolt pistol in his left, firing wildly in the direction of the retreating enemy. A skull hung from his belt, too huge to be anything but transhuman, staring at the battle with empty sockets. He moved even faster than the others, and the air around him shimmered with half-formed shadows of claws and fangs. The subordinate had a calmer attitude, though he moved just as fast. He held a bolter with both hands, and his shots were a lot more carefully aimed, even as he kept sprinting. Zirak saw one bolt hit a son of Kalth straight in the back of his helmet, sending the headless body tumbling to the ground. The young man knew that the Astartes had enhanced vision and reflexes, but he couldn't believe that such a shot was easy, even for them. Zirak kept running behind the Unbound as they pursued the retreating sons of Kalth. Around them, the air was filled with the sound of weapon fire, the clash of metal on metal and the screams of the wounded and the dying. Zirak could still taste the smell of the puppeteer's alchemical weapon, and spat to the ground to cleanse his mouth from the foulness of it. Even if it seemed the gas was now too thin to affect his mind, he was pretty sure that it wouldn't do him any good to have it in his lungs. 5 minutes after the renegades had passed the ruined wall, they clashed with the next line of defense of the Loyalists. Zirak had a few seconds to take in the battlefield, one of the Hive City many broad streets, where hundreds of thousands of individual vehicles had passed each day before the coming of the warp storm. Now, the cars laid in piles of burned wrecks, forming primitive barricades before the actual lines of defense the sons of Kalth and their allies were falling back to. There was a path through the walls of wreckage, but every meter of it was exposed to the fire of the few soldiers who had been left manning the final barricade at the beginning of the battle. If the Space Marines took position atop the wall, the attackers would be slaughtered by bolter shells until they could get some heavy artillery here to bring it down. Laser fire rained upon the attackers as they ran the gauntlet. Several humans fell, but the Unbound's armor protected them. It was only when they were halfway through that the true plan of the Loyalists revealed itself. On some unseen signal, charges that had been hidden among the wrecked cars detonated, causing an avalanche of metal to fall between the retreating Loyalists and their pursuers. Two of the Unbound were crushed by the falling debris, their dying screams muffled by the din of metal on metal. Unfazed, the rest kept on running, climbing up the pile while still under fire. Unlike the transhumans, it was difficult for Zirac to pass the obstacle. By the time he reached the top of the improvised wall, the battle was mostly over. Several more Unbound had fallen, but only one Son of Calth remained, and the human soldiers were firing ineffectively at the renegade Astartes, trying to aid their outnumbered champion. Unwilling to not have any part in the victory, Zirac looked around, and found a surviving Loyalist soldier, still aiming his las rifle at the Unbound from atop the barricade. Zirac judged that about 2 meters separated his current location atop the pile of junk from the soldiers, and jumped. For a few seconds, he hung in the empty air, knowing full well that if he had misjudged his jump he would fall into a pit of broken, sharp metal parts that would kill him horribly, if he was lucky. But he had put enough strength into his jump, and crashed into the trooper. Zirac went for the throat with his makeshift knife, but the soldier was wearing some kind of body armor that turned the weapon away. The butt of his weapon hit Zirac in the face, pushing him back and breaking his nose. Enraged, the heretic leapt again before the Loyalist could take advantage of the distance he had opened between them to fire. This time, the knife found a weak spot in the soldier's flak vest and pierced through his chest. With a feral snarl, Zirac twisted the short blade in the soldier's guts, grunting in displeasure when he felt it break while still inside. The man finally fell, clutching his belly as he died. Zirac took a deep breath that filled his lungs with the scent of blood and smoke. Looking around, he saw that the last of the defenders had also been slain, with other human fighters cleaning up the battlements and finishing the wounded. Then, a booming voice reached his ears, almost loud enough to physically knock him to the ground. "I have come to destroy the enemies of the Emperor." He turned his head toward the origin of the voice, and his blood froze. There stood a giant of blessed iron and consecrated ceramite, covered in insignia of devotion to the master of mankind and badges of honor earned through 100 campaigns. Each of the giant's arms ended in a massive power gauntlet, with the undying flame of a flamethrower at the center of the fist. A Son of Calth's helmet sat where the giant's head should be, glaring at the renegades with 2 green eye lenses. Below, written in golden letters, was the name of the warrior entombed within, Shilaro's dreadnought. The word pierced through the daze that had engulfed Zirac's consciousness like a dagger, and what he knew of the giant's nature flashed in his mind. A veteran of the Sons of Calth, wounded near unto death on the battlefield, and chosen to continue fighting beyond the ruination of his flesh by fusing with one of the greatest machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Terror flowed through the teen's veins, sending him into action. He could do nothing to harm the ancient space marine, all he could do was flee from his wrath. He took cover behind a piece of debris and watched, mesmerized, as the Unbound fought the ancient. They charged the machine, laughing and screaming challenges. Zirac noted that the leaders were holding back, watching without attacking yet. A second later, he understood why. "Burn, traitors!" The dreadnought unleashed his weapons, releasing 2 streams of fire that cooked the charging Unbound in their armor. Their screams turned from laughter to agony, and the smell of carbonized meat filled the air. One of them didn't fall, and got near enough that the dreadnought was able to swat him aside with his left power fist, breaking the charred form of the Unbound into pieces. Only 2 Unbound remained besides the commanding duo. The brutal death of their comrades made them hesitate, but a barked order of their leader sent them into motion. They separated, trying to flank the dreadnought while the leader advanced upon it and the sub-leader opened fire. Bolt shells clanked uselessly on the machine's frame, leaving nothing but scorch marks where they hit. "That's not going to be enough," Malone called out the shooter, sounding entirely too calm for this situation to Zirac's taste. "Trust me, Igdal," answered the other as he twirled his power sword in his hand and began cautiously approaching the dreadnought. "I have a plan." Moving faster than Zirac would have believed it possible for a machine this massive, the dreadnought caught one of the Unbound flanking it in his fist and crushed him with a sickening sound of breaking ceramite and pulped flesh. The other transhuman was incinerated by the dreadnought's other weapon, but the death of the 2 Unbound had apparently given their leader the opening he needed. Suddenly accelerating, Malone rushed toward the dreadnought while its arms were pointed in opposite directions. A glancing blow from its right power fist hit him in the head, sending cracks all over his helmet. Barely slowing from a hit that would have reduced a human skull to pulp, the Unbound ripped the headgear free and ducked below another burst of flame and rolled behind the dreadnought. He jumped back to his feet and then leapt at the dreadnought's undefended back. The blade bit deep inside the power pack of the dreadnought, tearing through cables and metal with a horrible wrenching sound. The machine screamed in an utterly monotone voice, jerking its body violently in an attempt to shake the Unbound loose, but to no avail. Holding firm with his left hand, Malone cut and cut, until at least, with a final machine cry of agony, the power animating the dreadnought failed, but not before the Ancient Entombed Within attempted one last act of vengeance. With a final impulsion, the dreadnought's legs overworked themselves, causing the whole armored walker to collapse backward. The Unbound jumped out of the way a fraction of a second before the machine hit the ground with enough force to cause tremors to reach Zirak's hiding place. There was a moment of silence, as the two Unbound watched the fallen machine. Slowly, Zirak emerged from behind his cover. The three of them were the only survivors. He wasn't sure whether that was a good thing for his chances of becoming unbound himself or not. Malone walked toward the immobile dreadnought, power sword still held tightly in his hand. The Unbound tore apart the dreadnought's sarcophagus with his power sword, cutting through plates of reinforced metal until he reached the life-sustaining cocoon where the half-living body of the Astartes who had controlled the downed machine laid. Chemical-smelling liquid poured from the opening, and Malone reached into the darkness of the coffin, searching blindly for a few seconds before pulling his arm out, and with it, the dreadnought's unfortunate pilot. Out of his murderous cybernetic frame, the Ancient was a rather pathetic sight. His body was little more than skin tended over thin bones. Only his left arm remained, and most of his chest had been replaced by a collection of artificial organs linked together by damaged cables leaking purified blood. His skin was pale as that of a corpse, and covered in scars. "You have lost, old one," said Malone softly to the Space Marines with the remnants. "This city will be ours. All of your brothers will die, and all those you have fought to protect will either die as an example of the price of defying us, or be put to work so that we may wreak further damage on your corrupt Imperium." Slowly, the ruined Astartes raised his skeletal right arm and touched the cheek of Malone with his last, trembling remaining digits. To the surprise of both Zirak and the Unbound, the wretched thing actually managed to speak. His voice was little more than a groan, but the words could still be understood, as could the raw despair and disbelief that permeated them. "Brother, why?" Then the hand fell away from the stunned Unbound's face, and the last of the Ancient's life left his body. Some corner of Zirak's mind felt as if he had been witness to something important, the passing of one more of the legionaries of old, those who were slowly but surely being replaced by the new breed of Space Marines the Codex Astartes was creating. But the bulk of his mind was focused on the fact that, very slowly, the Unbound named Malone was turning toward him, his face utterly devoid of expression. My lord?" he asked, uneasily taking a step back. "Malone," called the other transhuman warrior. "What are you doing?" "You know what I am doing. This is the second time something like that happened. It can't be a coincidence." "It could be a simple mutation," argued the second Unbound, though even Zirak could sense that he didn't believe whatever it was they were talking about. "We were warned that the Chaos Gods like to play games with those who have turned from the Emperor. That isn't what is going on here, and you know it. But even if it is, I can't let word of that spread." "What?" Zirak managed to force the words out of his throat. "What are you talking about, my lord?" The Unbound didn't answer with words. Instead, moving just as fast as Zirak had seen him move during the fight, he pounced on Zirak and caught him by the throat, letting the corpse of the ancient Space Marine collapse on the remnants of his armored form, more frail ones shattering on the impact. The young man only had time for one terrified flash of disbelief before the ceramite-clad hand of the Unbound crushed his throat, his windpipe, and his spine in a single tightening motion. Before the corpse touched the ground, Malone had drawn his bolt pistol and shot the other three humans who had survived the battle and witnessed the scene. The two sons of Mula Secundus stood alone, surrounded by the corpses of allies and enemies alike. In the distance, the sound of battle could still be heard, but none of them moved to join it. There was a moment of silence, then Igdal spoke. "Are you going to kill me now to keep your secret, Malone?" Shocked, Malone turned toward his brother. "What are you saying? I would never." This, remarked Igdal, disapproval in his voice, was hardly necessary. These men probably didn't understand what the ancient was talking about, if they even heard him speak. I, however, was there when we first killed a son of Calth. I remember how he too reacted when he saw your face, and the words he spoke before the end. But it isn't this that bothers me. I care nothing for which Primarch's blood runs through your veins. I am growing concerned about your attitude, Malone, continued the calmer Unbound, and there was genuine worry showing on his face as he removed his own helmet to look his childhood friend in the eye. We are all killers, but you seem to hold life in greater disdain than any of us. You weren't like that before Ascension. Could it be that something was done to your hormonal levels during your transformation? A cold sensation ran through Malone's bones as his brother's words registered. So far, he hadn't dwelled on his growing emotional detachment to murder. His entire life had been filled with violence, from the darkness of the land to the training chambers of the Hand of Ruin. But now, he recalled what Perennifer had said when he had just awoken from his transformation, or rather, what the sorcerer hadn't said. When Malone had asked him about the servant, questioning why he felt such contempt for it, the member of the coven had evaded the question. And now, Malone was wondering if Igdal were right, if the unspoken alterations Jacaerys had committed on him went beyond simply using a different source of gene seed. I will have answers, Igdal, swore Malone as he sheatheded both of his weapons. Jacaerys will answer for this. He is a fleshmaster, brother, and well regarded among his peers, said Igdal softly. He outranks you and he is far more experienced than both of us. He will kill you if you cross him. Even if you get the drop on him and put him down, the Warband would turn on you at once. He is very valuable to the Awakened One. If you really want revenge for what he did to your gene seed, you will have to bide your time. Malone turned toward his comrade, suspicion appearing on his face. You seem to have considered all of this already, he accused. Igdal shrugged. I haven't forgotten why I accepted to be made unbound in the first place, Malone. I still want revenge for what Jacaerys did on our home world. He used us all as guinea pigs, brother. He manipulated every tribe in the land for his own purposes. He did this at the command of the Awakened One. Do you plan of challenging him as well? Of course not. I am not an idiot. But I want Jacaerys to pay, and so do you. If you really used Ultramarine gene seed for your transformation, then you are in grave danger. If the other Unbound find out, let alone the older legionaries, Archon probably wouldn't care, thought Malone out loud. Many other veterans would even find it funny, I think, an insult to the Loyalists, and possibly a way to infiltrate them. But the rest would either ostracize me at best, or try to kill me at worst. And the other Unbound would probably jump on the excuse to kill you in the hope of taking your place as leader, concluded Igdal. So what are you going to do? For now, I am just going to talk, sighed Malone. Once this battle is over, I will go to Jacaerys and ask him about his motives. Who knows, he might even convince me that it was for a good reason. As much as we dislike him, neither of us can deny his genius. I doubt that will be so simple, said Igdal. In the meantime, you need to find a new helmet. If the Ultramarines can recognize your face's alterations, then maybe one of the older Forsaken Sons can too. Hell, for that matter, any of the Unbound could, if their training involved memories from a warrior who fought the 13th Legion. Malone looked around, and picked up a relatively intact helm off one of the Unbound's corpses. It set in place on his armor with some difficulty, and for a few seconds he saw nothing through the lenses but static, until the machine spirit of his wargear had finished integrating the new piece of headgear. We must find another of the invading forces, he said once his vision returned. Before I can speak with Jacaerys, we still have a war to win. Igdal chuckled. Good to see you still have your priorities straight. Orpheus laughed as he killed. He didn't mean it in mockery of those who fell before him, though many of those who fought alongside him and shared in his amusement did. It was just that the former Emperor's Children Legionary enjoyed this battle way too much not to express his pleasure vocally, and he held himself in too high esteem to indulge in the ecstatic screams many of his Legion brothers howled as they killed. His laughter was dignified and measured, but he knew even non-psychers could feel the intensity of the emotions it carried, the madness and corruption, some would call it. But only boorish souls would believe that. Emotion and sensation were the pillars of life, the only things making existence bearable. Even if the sorcerer was less of a hedonist than many of his kin, He was still a devotee of Slunch, and his psychic gifts gave him access to a whole new realm of experiences that would forever be denied to those less fortunate. He could hear the agony of the city's defenders, taste their anguish on his tongue, see their screeching souls burn in the warp whenever he closed his eyes. The symphony of war had engulfed Asthena, and Orpheus relished listening to it as much as he relished playing his own part in the orchestra. The northern wall had fallen quickly to the host of sensations that had descended from Nelimos at the Awakened One's command. The Gene Lords had brought with them siege machines crafted from living flesh and warp energy, and they had torn down the wall as soon as Orpheus had sensed the fall of the city's psychic defense. The engines were too huge and cumbersome to be brought into the city's streets, but that suited the servants of the Dark Prince just fine. Watching the awesome destruction unleashed by the demonic machines had filled them all with the desire to wreak destruction of their own. The host of sensations was many thousands strong, and their advance through the broken wall and into the retreating ranks of their foe was glorious. Cultists of Slunch screamed their praises to their patron even as they were cut down by controlled bursts of bolter fire. Raptors flew above the rest of the host in their haste to reach their prey, their howls amplified by their armor into demonic and predatory screeches. Noise Marines sent wave after wave of kinetic energy crashing into the Loyalists' ranks, laughing when they mistakenly caught a handful of cultists in the wave and the mortals were reduced to bloody pulp. Orpheus, however, didn't fight alongside his brothers. He had been given a task by Archon, which was the reason why he hadn't taken part in the Coven's ritual. After much reflection, the sorcerer had decided to reveal to his lord the murder of the Shailat warrior in Nelimos at the hands of one of their cultists. Archon hadn't been surprised, nor particularly angry at the responsible. If anything, Orpheus thought that the Lord of the Forsaken Sons had been impressed at the mortal's cleverness and audacity. Yet that murder had brought to light the fact that the Chaos forces holed up in Nelimos weren't as united as the others on Paraxis Alpha. There was a chance that they would turn on one another during the assault on Asthena, and an even greater one that they would repeat what the Emperor's children had done during the Siege of Terra. Archon hadn't seemed much concerned about the latter possibility for some reason. Maybe he didn't care, so long as loyal blood was spilled, but the former was an unacceptable eventuality. Orpheus had been chosen as his agent among the host, to keep the Shailat under control, and, if required, do anything necessary to preserve the alliance between the illuminated Xenos and the Warband. And so, the son of Fulgrim fought side by side with the Gene Lords and their escorts of warriors and creations. While most of the Shailat fighters were scattered among the rest of the troops, either leading their bands of cultists or fighting at the side of Astartes following the same path they did, each Gene Lord had called upon debts and bonds of loyalty to gather a few warriors at his side for this battle. Not that the reborn overlords of Paraxis were unable to defend themselves. Though each of them had been returned to the living world in a relatively identical body, they had all altered their flesh to reflect their own natures, creating a carnival of nightmares that was only matched by their lethality. Every Gene Lord had left his or her tower in Nelimos to join the battle, eager to test their skills and new pets in such a grand arena, as well as avenge the fall of their empire to the Ultramarines during the Great Crusade. One of them hovered above the battlefield, held aloft by 6 pairs of feathered black wings. Another was covered in chitin from head to toe, and Orpheus wasn't sure whether it was an armor or the Xeno's own skin. There were others with extraneous limbs, some of which held weapons, while others were weapons in their own right. All of them whose faces were still visible had left their visage untouched. They wanted their victims to look upon them and know that, no matter what they may now appear to be, they had at one point been Eldar. Pride in one's origins was important, after all. Still, Orpheus couldn't help but imagine what would be the reaction of the hidebound craft world elders if they ever met the Shailat, or even just learned of their existence. Paradoxically, Ezirith the Firstborn was the one that appeared the most normal of them all. Orpheus knew that the 2 tentacles rising from the Xenos Lord's shoulders were in fact attached to the suit of living flesh he wore, while his own body remained as it had been when he had first been freed from the cloning tank in which his new incarnation had grown. In contrast to the Shailat's murderous elegance and refined terror, the beasts that followed them onto battle were malformed, clumsy abominations. All of them had been humans before they passed under the knives of the Gene Lords, or whatever tools it was that the Xenos nobles employed on their unfortunate victims. But now, it was hard to find even one trace of their former nature, even with the enhanced sight of an Astartes or the psychic sense of a sorcerer. The former wasn't particularly shocking. Orpheus had seen some of the creations of his former legion's apothecaries during the heresy, and they too had looked nothing like the basic material. But the latter both fascinated and repugned him. Millions of civilians had been taken prisoner when Nalimos had fallen, and the Shi'alat overlords had claimed the greater part of that bounty for themselves, letting the rest be used for sport by the other components of the force that had conquered the city. Orpheus hadn't been allowed to set foot within one of the great towers they had raised, but he had heard the Shi'alat warriors speak of what occurred within, and he could now see the results for himself. Where once there had been living and thinking men and women, and probably children too, now there was only misshapen creatures whose every moment was pure agony. The Gene Lords had done more than reshape flesh and bone, more than modify the very genetic code of their captives. They had broken their spirit, shattered their souls until the subjects were technically alive, but projected nothing in the warp save for pain and anguish. Yet even in that state, the toys of the Shi'alat would continue to serve, and would only be allowed to die when it suited their owners. No two of them were identical, or even similar. The Gene Lords had only brought the best specimen of each of their designs. Orpheus suspected that to them, this whole battle was as much about honoring their alliance with Archon and feast on the destruction as it was about showing off their creations to their peers. As with their masters, the only thing the creatures shared, beyond their torment, was their lethality. Each had been gifted with several means of delivering death, from claws to acidic projectors. There didn't seem to be any control device implanted in them, and Orpheus couldn't detect any psychic coercion, yet the spawns followed their creator's command without question, struggling to keep up with the pace of the Shi'alat. They were unstoppable, though they left a trail of their own corpses in their wake. Hundreds had died since they had broken the wall, and more fell by the second, but the fallen were mostly rabble, and their deaths only made the true chosen of Slunch appear more heroic and powerful by comparison. With bursts of sorcerous fire and nightmarish projections, Orpheus was carving a path through the ranks of loyalist soldiers, his two stolan blades carving through flesh and armor with equal ease. In his more honest moments, Orpheus admitted to himself that while competent, he wasn't a true blade master, but he used his psychic gifts to compensate for any flaw in his skills, moving faster than any mere mortal could thanks to the power of the warp flowing through his muscles. This was the reason Orpheus had sought the forbidden power of the Empyrean in the first place, so that he could rise above his station as a mere battle brother of the Third Legion. Through studying the texts of the Word-bearers and listening to the preaching of the Neverborn who joined the 9 legions on their way to Terra, he had unlocked his own psychic potential and become one of the Emperor's children's new sorcerers. This had given him all that he had desired: power, recognition, prestige. His own brothers had threaded carefully near him, like they did near the apothecaries and the members of the Phoenix Lodge, where the chosen of Fulgrim had gathered before the Legion had broken apart at Hedris. Of course, such power had not come without a price. Even the sacrifices he had offered to the ruinous powers had merely been the beginning of his trials. He had been tested, was being tested, and would probably continue to be tested forever. The weak could not endure long under the eyes of the gods, and that was doubly true for those who could peer beyond the veil. This battle was an opportunity for him to unleash his full power, to show to the gods and the Neverborn just how strong he was, so that he would earn the favor of the first and the fearful respect of the second. With the rest of the Coven having broken the power of the Sons of Kalth's librarians, there was nothing in the Loyalists' arsenal that could stop him, and he reveled in the sense of triumph and superiority as he tore apart the slaves of the false emperor. But for all that he enjoyed the battle, Orpheus couldn't truly let himself go and embrace the frenzy of it. He still had his mission from Archon to perform, yes, and he couldn't watch over the Shi'alat if he let himself drown in his passions, but there was something else. The sorcerer knew something that the other members of the host could only feel deep within themselves, but that troubled them too. This battle wasn't an offering to Slunch. The Dark Prince had already received his offering when Nalimos had fallen, and what a glorious tribute that had been. This battle had been dedicated to Khorne by the Awakened One, who had chosen not to walk any of the dark paths but to stand in the middle of the conflicting gods, also that he could better lead the Warband. The sorcerer respected him for that choice, even if he also pitied him a little. How sad it was to be denied the pleasures brought by following the profligate one. He remembered precious little of his life before the Legion had dedicated itself to Slunch, but what he did remember was dull and bland beyond measure, to the point that he had difficulty processing the fact that he had willingly lived such an existence. He could sense the brutish presence of the blood god in the skies, and the contempt the war god held for him and all his kin. Part of him reveled in the sensation, but the greater part was both angry to be used in a ritual to a rival power and a little afraid. Arkhan had promised something to Khorne, what exactly, Orpheus didn't know, and this battle was the mean of delivering it. If the Forsaken Sons were to fail in honoring their liege's word, well, things would get ugly, really ugly, and not in any enjoyable way. The wrath of a Chaos God was something no force in the galaxy could endure, not even the false Emperor, for all his power, had been able to stop the Pantheon from destroying his dream for mankind. At the same time, he was also consumed by curiosity. What could Arkhan have planned that required the favor of all four Chaos Gods? The Lord of the Forsaken Sons had already gained Slash's and Nurgle's approval through offering them the cities of Nalemos and Talixorn, and was now on his way to obtain Khorne's, and Orpheus didn't doubt that there was some plan in motion to gain the favor of Xionch as well. What grand design had the Awakened One in mind for Paraxis? At the back of his mind, he heard the wailing of the tormented soul bound to him increase in intensity. The shade of Captain Galen was forced to watch as the son of Fulgrim laid waste to the last city his chapter had vowed to defend, and the loyalist ghost was powerless to do anything to stop it. The moan of the disembodied spirit reminded Orpheus of the other visions he had experienced during his pilgrimage among the ruins of Nalemos, and he quickly swept the host in search of another specific soul, sharing his attention between the battle and the psychic undertaking. He found his target easily, for even if that particular soul didn't shine any brighter than those of the Shai-Ilat, it was unique in that it was human, mostly. Mikhail Kashinenko, the Astartes hybrid who had killed the Shai-Ilat warrior in Nalemos, fought at the head of several hundred cultists, carefully directing them away from the enemy transhumans and into the weaker human soldiers. He moved faster than any unaugmented human could ever hope to achieve, dodging melee weapons and even bullets while his own attacks always found their target. Each strike was directed at a different part of his foe's body, and Orpheus could detect a surge of raw emotion in the hybrid soul every time he inflicted a new wound upon his enemies. But Orpheus could also feel something else in the hybrid beyond the pleasure of the slaughter, concern. Something was bothering him. The sorcerer prodded a little deeper into Mikhail's mind, careful to only observe and not damage anything. His brother Melchior would be angry if Orpheus damaged his prized subject. Soon, he found what had Mikhail uneasy, and immediately dropped off the emotional high he had been experiencing since the battle had begun. Cold realization tightened around his heart like a closing fist. The Chaos forces had attacked the city from all sides. They had troops all across the hive by now. And yet, as Mikhail had noticed, there hadn't been a single encounter with the hundreds of millions of civilians who had taken refuge in the city until now. Where in the Dark Prince's holy name were they? Orpheus remembered that a deal had been made between Arkhan and Khorne, and he almost heard the cruel laughter of fate. If the accord had involved the missing civilians in any way and the Forsaken Sons were unable to find them, he stopped dead in his tracks, disposing of his current enemy with a sharp burst of psychic power that reduced the son of Kalth's head to a bloody mist, and sharply pulsed to a cadre of Shai-Ilat warriors to abandon their pursuit and form a protective circle around him. They obeyed his order, though he could feel their fury at being commanded so. Then, once he was sure no one would be able to attack him, the Slayer Ineshi sorcerer sent out his mind, scanning the entirety of the hive. One could not hide so many souls, even with wards and meters of permacrete. He would find where the sons of Kalth had hidden them, and then something hit his soul in the immaterium, lifting his body in the air and sending it crashing into a building several dozens meters across the broad streets. He distantly felt several of his bones break, and tasted blood in his mouth as his brain began to bleed after the psychic impact. As he fell into unconsciousness, the last thing he perceived was a laughter that was vaguely familiar to him. The last thought that crossed his mind was the recall of when and where he had last heard it, and the last emotion he felt before darkness took him was a mix of shock and horror at that realization. We have been deceived.